Today is April 14th, 2026, and this is Laura Ettinger representing the City of Savannah's Municipal Archives as a volunteer. I am interviewing Glenda Anderson for the Savannah Community Memory Project, and we are conducting this interview at the Adams Administrative Building in Savannah. Glenda, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm excited about this, and so I thought we would start at the beginning. So can you tell me a little bit about your early life in Savannah?
Okay. My family actually moved to Savannah when I was 5 years old. I had not started to school yet. My dad had been working for the United States Postal Service in Augusta. Someone here had a heart attack, and he came to do a temporary relief for that man here in Savannah. Well, he decided to retire, and so they offered my father the job. And so my family moved here when I was 5 years old, which would have been, 1956, I believe. And I grew up in an East Side neighborhood that then was called Wagner Heights. It has since been renamed. It's now referred to as the Benjamin Van Clark neighborhood. And Benjamin Van Clark was one of the foot soldiers in the civil rights movement here in Savannah, is my understanding. We lived in a neighborhood that was sort of middle class, I guess, and we were actually in a house where our church organist had grown up. So we were always very proud, that we had someone in the church music department who was a former resident of our home. And there were 5 children in my family. I'm the oldest. And then I had 3 sisters and 1 brother, and they were 2 sets of twins that were a year, a month, and a week apart in age. The first twins were 3 years younger than me, and the next ones were 4 years younger than me. So we had quite a rowdy household with a lot of childhood play going on. One of my favorite memories is that we had a porch swing on the front of our house, and anytime it was raining, we all, 5 of us at one time, sat in the porch swing, and we sang everything we could think of to sing, swinging ourselves back and forth. We were not supposed to go over the back banister because there was a fig tree there, and the neighbors were very protective of their fig tree. And we were not supposed to kick off from the front door, which was opposite the front of the swing, but we managed to do that quite often. And our favorite song was "She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain When She Comes," and we would make up verses until we were all blue in the face from trying to come up with a new rhyme. That was a favorite thing. We did a lot of walking in those days. It was about, maybe 8 or 10 good long city blocks from our house to the elementary school where we all went to school. And that was just a wonderful place to me. We had wonderful teachers. I had teachers that were at the end of their careers or close to the end of their careers, very experienced, with the exception, I think, of just one. And in fact, my first grade class, we were the last class that our teacher was teaching. She was retiring at the end of the year. So we had a newspaper interview, and we all made retirement cards for her. And one of my favorite memories of Miss Annie Moore, is that her method of discipline was, if we were too chatty, which all of us were, she would ask us to sit at the chalkboard with our nose in a circle of chalk until we could calm down and she could get on with whatever she was trying to do with the class. And it worked marvelously.
Wow.
And then my 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Wainwright, read to us every day after lunch. She'd have everybody sit with their head on their desk for 15 or 20 minutes. And she read from what now is called a series book, so there was always a cliffhanger at the end of every chapter, and we always wanted her to go on and read some more, but she, very disciplined, only read 1 chapter a day, and it was great. My 4th grade teacher, Ms. Saunders, was the one who made me want to become an archaeologist, because she brought all of her old issues of National Geographic to the classroom, and we would have some time every day when we could do something just for recess in the classroom, sort of. And we all, just immediately went to the National Geographics. So half the class wanted to be archaeologists. And then I think the teacher that had the most impact on me was my fifth grade teacher, Miss Sile. Um, she was just a very exuberant individual, and she was very convinced that every one of us was going to grow up to be someone important in our society. So she wanted us to be well equipped to handle that responsibility. And so the chalkboards in those days were like in 3-foot sections of black, and she had the thing with lots of fingers that held the chalk in the ends, and each of us, every grade period, everyone in her class had to line their section of the chalkboard. We had to prepare an outline of what we were going to speak about, and she was very convinced that it should exhibit what she called parallelism. So if your first Roman numeral began with a verb, then all your Roman numerals would begin with a verb. If your first Arabic numerals began with a noun, all of them would begin with a noun. And we had to have that written on the board before we started speaking. Then we had to have it on index cards. And everyone, every grade period, had to stand up in front of the class and give a little report. And 6 weeks it would be something on history, and the next 6 weeks it would be science, and the next 6 weeks it would be literature, whatever. But if you were ever going to think you had a fear of public speaking, she took care of that.
In the fifth grade?
In the fifth grade, she was amazing. She played piano, and we've talked a little bit, you and I, about my love of music. She loved music, and she played the piano, so maybe not every day, but at least 2 or 3 times a week, we had a music period. At that point in elementary education, we didn't change classes to have subject specialists. Our teacher taught us everything. So she would have a music period, and we would sing folk songs, and I can still remember the words to some of them, like, do you remember Sweet Betsy of Pike, who crossed the wide prairie with her husband Ike, with two loads of cattle and 2 heads of cattle and 1 spotted dog, a Shanghai rooster, and an old yeller dog. And not only did she like music and folk songs and patriotic songs, of course, she also loved folk dances. And so we would spend maybe, during 1 grade period, we would learn folk dances of various kinds. And she had these recordings that she would play, and we would dance. We would have dance periods. Of course, the boys hated it, the girls loved it, but we all had to do it, regardless of how we felt about it. She taught us how to be polite to one another as partners, et cetera, et cetera. She was just a jewel. She really was.
Can you spell her last name?
It's Seyle,
Okay.
Miss Sile.
Sile. Okay.
And I believe she was Miss Sile and not Mrs. Sile.
Okay.
And then my last teacher in elementary school was Mrs. Kinnickle, and her family owns a huge printing company here that's, has been part of the Savannah business community for a long, long time. And she was the person who sort of drove our class to be competitive, to try to make all of us better. So she would do things like, she had this little mobile board, and she would stand at the blackboard and she would put a math problem on the board, and then she would say ready, and she'd push the panel out of the way, and the first person who worked it ran to the blackboard to put the answer up. And so we were always trying to one-up each other. And we had members of our classes there who went all the way through school together, so we were seniors in high school together. And when I saw one of them, several years ago in our 50th class reunion, he wanted to know if I was still as competitive now as I had been then.
In the 6th grade.
In the 6th grade, and I said, no, I've calmed down a lot. I don't think I have to be the first to the board for everything. And she was also a diagram sentences person.
Oh, okay.
So we did a lot of sentence diagramming, which you don't appreciate at the time, but as I got older, and I majored in English in college, so those skills that she gave us then were just invaluable at that point, because you're having to do so much writing so fast with so little time to be really careful. And when I went to Armstrong State College here for my undergraduate degree, because I was majoring in English, there was a list of automatic F eras.
Wow.
That if you made one on any written essay that you did as part of a test in the English department, it didn't make any difference how good everything else was, you still got an F.
That's intense.
So that was very intense at the time, and I remember being very frightened about that because I was on a scholarship, partial scholarship, and I knew I had to keep the grades, and so I sort of developed the habit of I would try to write and give myself about 10 or 15 minutes at the end to go back and proofread everything I had done to make sure that all the subjects and verbs agreed and there were no dangling participles and all of those things. And luckily I never made a poor grade in an English class. The one that I did make a poor grade on that I was very surprised about was political science. You know, it was one of those professors who gave a midterm and a final and that was it. And, you know, I was very attentive and went to class every day, took notes and studied and read what I was supposed to read, and I thought I was doing fine until I hit the midterm. Oops. First D I think I had ever gotten in any class in my entire life, and I was absolutely terrified. So I immediately scheduled an appointment with the professor so that I could find out, is there any extra credit work I can do to bring this grade up?
And this was when you were at Armstrong State.
Yeah,
This
at
was in
Armstrong
college.
State.
Yeah.
But, you know, my family, you know, you asked me about my childhood, and I've gotten way beyond that.
That's
But
okay.
we used to walk to the public library it was a little tiny branch library in the basement of my Romana Riley Elementary School, and I believe it was called the Waters Avenue Branch Library. But we would walk in the summertime, and each of us would carry a pillowcase or whatever kind of bag we had, a brown grocery bag, whatever, because you could check out as many books as you wanted as long as you brought them all back in 2 weeks. So we would skip and hop and, you know, run and everything to get there. And then we would trudge back with these heavy bags that we were carrying with all these books. And, you know, you could pick out anything. You could pick out picture books even if you were, you know, in the 5th grade. And what I loved to read were all the little tiny, they were about probably 5 by 4 little biographies of all the major people, you know, in American society and history. And I think I read every single one they had, you know. And then when I got into older grades of elementary school, they let me help and shelve books in the library there.
In elementary school?
In elementary school, they let me help and shelve books. And I like to talk to myself when I was shelving because I would read the titles to myself and, you know, I would make a comment on, I like this picture that's on the front of the cover or whatever. And the librarian one day said to me, you make too much noise when you're in the library and you could never grow up to be a librarian because you can't be quiet. which was true. She was absolutely right. But it was sort of a challenge. It's like, what? You're going to tell me I can't do something? Sorry.
I'm in.
I'm in. So I think that's where it might have started.
And this was late elementary school?
Right, like probably 5th or 6th grade.
When you were volunteering?
When I was volunteering. Right.
And talking to yourself?
And talking to myself,
Right.
making too much noise. The other thing I loved about our neighborhood was as I got older, not so much when I was younger, but when I got into middle school and high school, I would study later at night, and then I would take our dog for a walk around the block, and it was 10 or 10:30 at night. I always went by myself. I never carried a flashlight. There was no reason to be concerned, you know, and that's a long, long time ago. It's not that way in urban neighborhoods anymore, you know. Now I would, even when my child grew up and we were in a very safe neighborhood, I would have, no, you can't go by yourself. Either your dad or I has to go with you. And you certainly have to carry a flashlight and a whistle or something, you know, which that's so different. And we had a neighborhood candy store, and it was a confectionery, I guess they called it. And we could go in, you know, when we got our allowance every week and buy a couple of pieces of candy for a nickel or a dime or whatever. Oh, and I should tell you about my life of crime.
I'm looking forward to hearing about this.
I also walked to my junior high school, and there was a very nice confectionery there that had lots of ice cream on a stick. like chocolate fudge popsicles, which I absolutely loved. And I decided that if I didn't use my money to buy milk in the cafeteria at school every day, because we carried our own lunches, even though you could buy school lunches.
Right.
But my mother liked to decide what we were going to eat, so we took school lunches. We took lunches from home. I decided if I didn't buy milk, I could save that money, and by the end of the week, I would have enough money to buy a chocolate fudge popsicle on the way home from school every day that day. So I did that for about 4 or 5 weeks, and I got away with it. It was wonderful. And by the distance was just right. By the time I got from school to the confectionery and bought my popsicle and then went home, I had time to eat it and, get rid of the stick and do away with the evidence. The school cafeteria director called my mother after about 6 weeks and wanted to know if the family didn't have enough money for me to buy milk, because she had a program where I could get some assistance. My mother was livid. She said she's had her milk money every day, every day that she's been in school. What's going on here? So I was found out, and that was the end of my life of crime.
I'm sorry to hear that, because that sounds very fun.
It was fun, and it worked out quite well. I think I could have handled details of more complex criminal actions, but I learned my lesson then very, very much. I couldn't talk on the phone. I couldn't play outside with my friends for a certain period.
You were punished.
I was definitely punished for dishonesty.
Tell me a little bit more about your parents.
Okay, my parents. My mother was one of 11 children. Both of them grew up in rural areas on farms in either Richmond County or Columbia County, Georgia, which are north of Savannah, but still sort of on the Savannah River. My mother was one of 11 children. She was in the middle. She was the middle child. There were 10 girls and 1 boy. They had 9 girls first, and then they had the son, and then they had another girl. And the joke in our family, and her family always was, that when they finally had a boy, her father thought that the tide had changed and they were going to have some boys. He wanted some sons to help him work on the farm, of course. But then the 11th child was a girl, and my grandmother said, "That's it, no more children." I'm done having children. When the youngest one was born, she was already an aunt to 3 children of her oldest sisters. So, it was that kind of a family. My mother was very interested in education, and she had her favorite teachers that she had in school. And one of the stories that she used to tell about a teacher that she just loved so much. In their family, everybody passed their shoes down, because that's the way things were done then. So by the time they got to her in the middle, they didn't last too much longer. And so she often found herself cutting cardboard soles to put in her shoes, because they walked back and forth to school every day. She had a teacher somewhere along the line when she was maybe 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, something like that, who gave her a pair of shoes very discreetly on the side where nobody knew that she had given her a pair of barely used shoes, which my mother said she wore until she could not get her feet in them anymore, because she loved them so much. But she loved that teacher because she was very sensitive and discreet about the way she handled lots of things that went on. So she was like a hero to my mother. My mother wanted to be a teacher. She was valedictorian of her high school class, and you'll love this. I was valedictorian of my high school class. My daughter was the valedictorian of her high school class. No expectation ever held out to us. It was just, that's part of the drive my mother had. But of course, she graduated in 1941, 42, and she immediately joined the Navy as a WAVE, the Women's Auxiliary of the Navy. And so she spent, 2 or 3 years, serving in the Navy, and she never went overseas, but she did go up north. She was in Aberdeen for a while, and she made dear friends among her fellow WAVEs, and they would take trips to New York. It was a broadening of her horizons that she had never expected to have, and she just loved it. And my father also grew up on a farm, and his family was not quite as close as my mother's family. There were five of them, five or six, older sisters, and his brother was younger than him. And I don't know this for a fact because my father never said it to me, but from the pictures that I've seen and some stories that I've heard, I think his father was an alcoholic. And so he grew up being very protective of everybody. He was the oldest son. So he grew up being very protective of everybody in his family. He left school after the 8th grade and went to work as a mechanic. In World War II, he was in the Army, and he went into France after D-Day and then all the way across to Germany as part of the crew that worked on Jeeps and other, equipment to keep them running, making sure they ran. He hated the military. He said it was all about hurrying up and waiting. And once he hurried up, he did not want to wait. He wanted to get on with whatever it was they were supposed to do. My father was a tyrant on Sunday mornings. He herded up his girls and his son and made sure that we were at church well before things started because he did not like people who were not punctual. And I used to love to hear his stories about the R&R that they gave the troops in Europe. They were exhausted physically, and really all they wanted was rest. And they would take them all to the opera somewhere. My dad had never been exposed to opera. And so his description of it was, he said, they would sing very quietly for a while and everybody would go to sleep because they were just exhausted. And then all of a sudden somebody would start screaming and wake everybody up. He said the most decent thing they could have done was just continue to sing quietly so they could get their rest. It was, my father would not talk very much about World War II. And when we got assignments from school, in the 50s, we did get those assignments to talk to someone in your family about what it was like in World War II when it was Veterans Day. We would get those assignments. And my father would write a note to the teacher and say, it is not appropriate for adults to speak with children about what went on in that war. But as I got older, he had brought some things back with him, and one of them was this about a 6 or 7 foot long plan of a place that he actually picked up when he was in that place. He went into some place that was in the side of a mountain, and the drawing showed like a central walkway or little road, and then there were all these little spokes off of it. And when I got old enough to be in college and I was reading, and I read a lot of Eli Wiesel's books. He said that this was a place where they built the V-2 rockets that they fired on England. And he said it was, each of those little spokes had a workbench in it and a pallet on the floor, 1 plate, 1 fork, and 1 spoon. And he said it was a 2-person crew that worked in those places, and they worked, one of them worked 12 hours and then went to sleep, and the other one worked 12 hours. That was all they did. They never left the place. They ate out of the same plate, and they let them work until they died. So I've never done the research to find out where that place might have been. I took the plan to Tiffany Bueno, who's the archivist she's the research center director at the Mighty 8th Air Force Museum out in Pooler. And there was somebody there who could translate the German, and they said the legend on the plan did not tell them where it was. It just told them it was a renovation for some particular area of space. But anyway, he talked about that, but he would not talk about anything else. So I think he saw horrible things that he just did not want to remember. He wanted to forget them. Absolutely. And his younger brother lied about his age and probably joined the military at about the age of 16. And when he came back after the war, he was constantly in trouble about something and drank way too much. And I think now we would know that he was suffering from PTSD. But at that point in time, nobody talked about that. They would, I would occasionally hear my father say somebody was shell shocked, but you know, it was something you kept quiet in the family and you dealt with it as best you could. Privately, yeah. And when he, well, we're not sure whether he committed suicide or whether he just got drunk and fell in the river in Augusta, but they fished him out of the river sometime when my dad was probably in his early 40s, maybe about that time. And my father had to go and identify his body, and it was one of the hardest things I had ever seen him experience was doing that, because he had tried. But but my dad, he could work circles around everybody, and did. And what he did when he retired was he went back to the home that belonged to my mother's mother. What happened, I should tell you that little story too. What happened with that was that when there was a certain group of my mother's sister's spouses who all either volunteered or were drafted into the military about the same time for World War II. But what they did before they left was they built a house for my grandmother. None of them were construction people, but they just decided they had to build her a house because they wanted to make sure that their wives or their girlfriends, whichever it was for the particular sister, had a place to live if they didn't come back from the war. And so that was always a special thing that we loved very much, because she and my maternal grandfather had just bought a piece of property, their first one that they had owned outright completely themselves, And
That's
so,
amazing.
and so that was the contribution they decided they would make. And the spouses of all my mother's sisters were pretty close friends all the way through their lives. It was very,
That's amazing.
that's the way we grew up, was with a big extended family, and then as long as my grandmother was alive and still in that home, every Sunday, our routine on Sundays were we got up and everybody went to early church. My mother taught Sunday school. My dad on Saturday, no, I think so. I think he cooked the fried chicken on Saturday, and my mother prepared the rest of a meal that would feed all of us, plus my grandmother. And as soon as the worship service was over at, 8:30, 9:30, 10:30, we all went home, changed our clothes, and we drove to Augusta every Sunday, once a month, not every Sunday, once a month, every month, to see my grandmother. And whatever family that still lived in that area would come and visit as well. So lots of playing with cousins, lots of ruining clothes and shoes because there were red clay hills right where they had drainage ditches for the road, and we loved sliding down them.
That's fun. So, a couple of things. One, before we, because I want to move on to.
Yeah, I haven't told you much about Savannah,
yeah.
have I?
Well, no, that's okay. You know what? I think let's get to that later. Let's
Okay.
talk about sort of Savannah then and now later. Let's not worry about that.
Okay.
What about, you mentioned that you were valedictorian of your high school. I know I'd read that was Savannah High School, right, that you were valedictorian of. Tell me a little bit about either your high school experience or what you were like in high school. Let's talk about that a little bit before we move
Okay.
on to college and librarianship and all of that. So.
Okay. I was a very diligent student because my mother had sisters who had children who were in college or had gone to college. So the mantra that I heard from her growing up was, don't you ever have a child until you yourself can support you and the child by yourself. And she said the way you do that is you go to college and you learn something that you can earn enough money to make a home for yourself and a child. And one of the reasons she said that was because one of her dear friends, when we were, most of us were just finishing elementary school. Her husband was a firefighter. He had a heart attack and died. And she had 3 children. She had never worked outside the home. And at that point, pensions and insurance were not what they are now. So she had to become a career mother, which she did successfully. And anyway, there's another story to go with that comes at the end of the thing, but I'll tell you right now. When my mother died early at age 59 of ovarian cancer,
Sorry.
a year later, my dad came and asked me if it would be okay if he dated, because he was lonesome, and he really was very lonesome. And I said, sure, but I said, I don't want you chasing somebody who's my age in a short skirt. I said, I want you to find a woman your own age. So, a couple of Sunday nights later at Sunday night church, he did the same thing he did when he was a teenager to see if somebody wanted to go out on a date. He wrote a note, passed it down the entire row of the back row of church, and asked this lady if she'd like to go out and get a little bite to eat after church. Is that not just precious?
Adorable.
Just precious, just adorable. You know, I thought, you know, if he was the right age, I might marry this man. But anyway, that woman was the woman whose husband had died when her oldest son had just started what then was called junior high school, her oldest child. And she had 2 daughters that were younger. And that was who he invited out to dinner. And a year later, they were getting married. And all of my mother's sisters said she was just like one of their sisters. You know, she could have been one of their sisters as easily as anybody else. But anyway, now what were we talking about before that? We were talking about high school.
Yeah, but I'm glad you
I
told
don't
me
know
that
how
story.
I got off on all of that. My diligence about education. I
Yeah.
wanted to make the honor roll. I wanted to make good grades all the time. I wanted to learn. And my best high school teacher was my biology teacher. Her name was Mrs. Morgan. Mrs. Morgan believed that if you learned everything in her class, you made A's on everything, or you got everything right on all her tests, you did everything she asked for, you deserved a C. Because that was what you were in her class for, was to learn beginning biology. And she expected you to learn beginning biology. Now, if you wanted to make a better grade, you could talk to her individually about what she would like for you to do in order to earn a better grade. More dissections or more research on this or that topic. Most of mine turned out to be research that I did in journals on certain topics in biology. And you might do enough to earn a B or an A, but she gave very few A's. She's one of the few teachers I ever had in high school for whom I could not earn an A. I made a B all year long in her class. Worked myself to death, but it taught me something about what real achievement is. You know, I've never forgotten it. I've never forgotten it. I loved her. And I did not, when I was going back through my annuals when we were planning our 50th our class reunions, I really didn't have much time to go through them for any of the earlier reunions. But I realized there were a lot of clubs that went on after school that I had not been a part of, that I would really love to have been a part of. But I was working. I was working in the library every afternoon after school. I got a work permit when I was 14, and I became the page for the assistant director, Miss Frances Reese. Her father was the pastor of one of the oldest Methodist churches in Savannah, the Wesley United Methodist Church downtown, very esteemed congregation. And so she sort of took me under her wing from then on until I finished college. But I went to work every afternoon, and that way I could afford the gas and insurance for this little light baby blue Dodge Dart that my father bought from a used car dealer somewhere. I had a car.
How fun.
And I loved working on the annual staff. I think I started as a junior. At that time, we didn't start high school until we were 10th graders. We were sophomores. But having that car, we could load up the typewriters and whatever stuff we were working with on the yearbook staff, and we could all go and spend the evening with our advisor, our faculty advisor, who was just wonderful. Right now I can't remember her name, but I could see her. But anyway, she was just wonderful. And she would let us come to her house, and we would talk about all sorts of life's questions. And
This was the faculty advisor for?
sure, for the yearbook staff.
For the yearbook
everybody.
staff,
And the
okay.
yearbook staff did not meet after school. We met at the last period of the day,
Okay.
which conflicted directly with the chorus and the band because they also met the last period of every day.
Which you were also involved in.
I would love to have been in the chorus, but I never was because I decided I wanted to be on the yearbook staff.
Okay.
And I think that was mostly because I had friends that had come with me from junior high school to high school, and we all did it together. And then I had made some really good friends, um, and there were really good people in my high school class. The classes that I was in, because I was tracked, for college prep. We have one man from our class became a gastroenterologist, and ultimately became the president of the American College of Gastroenterologists before he retired. We had another one who went to Tech. I don't know whether he went to Georgia Tech or to Tech into engineering school in another state, but he ultimately went to work for the labs in Huntsville, Alabama, and he was part of the team that designed the original Star Wars security initiative under President Ronald Reagan. And then we had one young woman that I knew in middle school and in high school, and I was terrified of her. Her mother had died when she was very young, and her father had raised her, and he was a, what do you call them, the boats that take people out on the water and they know where all the good fishing is.
Mm-hmm.
He was a boat captain. So what did he teach his daughter? He taught his daughter to be a boat captain. And she was tough, and she had a gang of girls that were tough when we were in middle and junior high school. And we had to take showers every day after PE because that was when John Kennedy had his physical fitness initiative. I was terrified when I had to be in the shower stalls with all those girls around me because I was a wimp. I mean, absolute physical wimp. There has never been a ball game that I could do well. My only sport in high school and college and in my early years was I learned to ski, water ski, because my husband and all his family skied. And I still had a little bit of a competitive spirit, so I learned to slalom. And his family are all boys, three brothers. I learned to jump a double wake just like all of those boys.
Wow.
I killed myself a couple of times getting thrown into the marsh. And my favorite memory of water skiing is the time his father, who was a Marine in World War II and believed he was a Marine for the rest of his life, he decided to pull me behind a shrimp boat with its nets out. What are they doing when the nets are out? They're actually gathering shrimp,
Yes.
and they throw chum out the back of the ship, the boat, to attract the shrimp and anything else they might attract, such as sharks. And the boat, the little motorboat would go up over the wake of that shrimp boat. It was very high, and it would disappear on the other side, and I'm still on this side of the wake. And that's the most terrified I've ever been in my life. I could not turn loose because I didn't know what was in the water underneath me, but I couldn't see the boat, and I'm just, going through the wakes, up and over. That was the time that I said to my husband, who was then my boyfriend, I said, "Your father is never going to pull me on a ski again." I said, "You're going to have to drive the boat, or one of your brothers is going to have to drive the boat, because I'm not getting on a ski with him driving."
Understandably.
I did, in fact, get on a ski other times, but we were at the lake where there are no sharks in the water.
You're not worried about shrimp and sharks.
Yeah, so that was part of my high school years. This is a good story. I ran for a student council seat when I was in middle school, and my opponent was this really nice-looking young boy who was very polite and very intelligent and very outgoing. He was just such a gentleman. I was beaten handily. I mean, every girl in the school voted for him, no questions asked. Most of the boys do, because they knew him. He played sports. And so, at that point in life, I was raised very conservative Southern Baptist. And at that point in life, Baptist girls did not dance. But I was determined I was going to the sock hops, so I always worked in the concession stand at the sock hops. So the first sock hop dance that we had after that election, Lynn Thomas came and asked me, I'm doing Coca-Colas, and selling candy bars. He asked me if he could have a dance, that I had been a worthy opponent. And I loved Lynn from then on, although we didn't actually move in the same groups of friends. But when we had our 50th class reunion, we went and toured the building that was our high school at that point, which has become the Savannah Arts Academy. So it's a magnet academy for, arts education. We toured the campus, and we were talking, and his wife had died, and he talked to me about that, and we sort of reminisced. It was a sweet experience, and we both talked about that student council race. That's what everybody makes their own posters and all that sort of thing. It was a lot of fun. So I did some things, but I mostly concentrated on making good grades, being a really good student, and I read everything I could get my hands on. I just loved to read at that age.
So that will lead me to something else, which is sort of your draw to librarianship. I mean, obviously you started working in the libraries when you were very young. When you were late elementary school, you were volunteering, right?
Yeah.
But so what drew you to librarianship? I mean, what do you think? And it might be hard. I mean, since you had a whole very long career as a librarian, it might be hard to almost remember.
I don't really remember, other than that I loved to read, and my mother loved to read. She didn't have that much time to read, but I have this mental picture of her. In our kitchen, we had one of those aluminum tables with they all mostly had red or blue tops and the aluminum legs, and she had a little bench that she sat on that had the same color leather. It wasn't leather, it was some kind of vinyl or something top. And she would perch herself on that bench in the kitchen with her Reader's Digest or whatever book she was reading at the time, and she would read when she had a few moments to do that. And so I think I thought that was what you were supposed to do. After we had chores to do. We washed dishes and dried dishes, and we folded the clothes from the laundry, and we, she did these cleaning marathons every Saturday where she hid pennies, and if you didn't dust in the right place. But she would hide better coins in the places that we didn't get around to dusting. So you could fatten your chest if you did this. But when she wasn't doing any of that, she would sit at the table in the kitchen and read. So I associated that with being in charge and an adult. My mother was definitely in charge of the home. But anyway, I think because I loved Frances Reese so much, she was just a darling of a person. She loved the Beatrix Potter stories, and so she collected the Beatrix Potter figurines. And after I think either when she retired or after she died, her family gave those back to the children's department at the public library. She had friends who got her tickets to the Masters golf tournament every year. She loved golf, and so I just thought this was so exotic, And I liked the library atmosphere at the time because I spent a lot of time around my aunts and the extended family, and the women were in charge. I mean, there was a woman that was the director. The department heads were women. The administrative assistant who took care of all the money and the finances and telling people what to do, she was a woman. And I think I sort of developed the concept that this was a place where women could work, and it was other than school, that was my exposure to women working. And so I think it just and then she wanted me to go to Columbia when I finished undergraduate school. I was planning to teach English.
When you went to Armstrong
When I went
State.
to Armstrong, my goal was I wanted to teach high school English because I had just loved the things I read so much in high school. And so that was kind of what I was planning to do, is become a teacher. Well, I think she started planting a little, seed in my ear fairly quickly that I should go to library school. I shouldn't just start teaching when I finished college. And she wanted me to go to Columbia because that was where she had gone to school. And I had no desire to go to New York. Not at all. By that time, I already had a boyfriend who was sort of Savannah based, and and that played a factor. But anyway, then I think what she did was, especially because she had connections to the Methodist faith, And Emory University in Atlanta was originally a Methodist campus.
Mhm.
She managed to get me a very good graduate fellowship to Emory, and so I went to Emory
For your master's in
for my
library.
master's in the field. Yes, and there my intention was that I was going to become a children's librarian because that she was in charge of all the children's functions, and I knew the literature of that field at the time because I handled all the book orders for her.
Mhm.
She quickly found out that I was pretty good in math, and so if she had a title that she wanted 4 copies ordered for 4 branches, I could do the math in my head after about a month, speed it up, and that would relieve her of that task. So I knew what they were buying. You know, I knew the literature then of children's librarianship. It's very different now, much more diverse than it was then. I mean, there were things that were considered the classics, and those were the things you tried to buy for collections and so forth. It's not quite that same way now, but anyway, that was my goal. And so then by the time I finished graduate school, my husband was finishing school in Atlanta, and this is a funny story too. I graduated in early August, or mid-August, from Emory with my graduate degree, and my wedding was going to take place on September the 14th. And I made my wedding gown between the time I graduated and the time I got married.
Wow.
My mother moved. The other thing I like to do was sew. My mother and dad moved the furniture out of the living room in our home,
Wow.
and we vacuumed the floors 2 or 3 times, and then that was where I spread out the material on the floor to cut it out to make a wedding gown. I mean, absurd. What idiot would do that?
That's extraordinary.
What if something had gone wrong, for Pete's sake?
So, and actually, just making sure I do have the timeline in mind, you graduated from high school in 1968, right?
69.
69, and then from Armstrong State College with degree in English in 1973.
Right.
And then from Emory with your master's in, was it master's in library science?
Master's in librarianship.
Master's
That's
in
what my degree
librarianship
is.
in August of 1974, got married in September of 1974. Yeah.
And I did not work for, I guess, 2 months after our wedding because we were in the process of trying to get a home established in Atlanta. And my husband already had a job. That's right. He had been working and went full time with his employer, which was Sears Roebuck at the time. And he was doing something in their return and repair place, which what I've always said about my husband is there is nothing he cannot fix. Nothing. Except he thinks he's met his match with the last car we bought because it's mostly a computer on wheels, is what he says, which he is very displeased with because he can't, get under the hood and take everything apart. I've never seen him take apart anything and lay all the parts out on the floor that he can't get them back where they're supposed to be. If I did that, disaster. It would just be absolute disaster. But anyway, we got ourselves established and we started our lives in Atlanta. I worked for the Atlanta Public Library System, and I was the assistant director of the main library's general research department. And one of the things I loved that we did with that while I was there, I mean, now the internet makes this totally, it was just archaic sounding, but we had subject reference departments at the main library in Atlanta. We had the general reference department, which was mostly literature. We had a genealogical special collection. We had an African American history special section. Then we had a business department. We had an art department, reference department, business reference department. We had a government documents reference department. And I think we had a science reference department. Well, after I had been there for a year or two, we got our heads together and we decided that we wanted to try to create a little telephone service. We wanted to have a mini room where we put the reference material that we used most often to answer questions. And we'd have a bank of phones where the initial calls that wanted a piece of information would come into that little room. And if we could answer the question in 5 minutes, then we would answer it and we'd be done with it. If we couldn't answer it in 5 minutes, we would write the question up and put it in the bin for the subject reference department. and then they would handle it because it was more involved than we could do with a set of basic reference books. But one of the first things I did when I went to work for them was I was told to read the shelves, which means you go through a reference department and you take every book that's a reference book off the shelf. You look at the table of contents, you look at how it's set up, you see what kind of index it has, so you know where to go to look for answers. Well, archaic, right? I mean, but that's the way we did it.
Yeah.
And you're probably not quite old enough to know that we used to have to research papers where we had to do a literature search out of the bound print volumes of the periodical indexes for that discipline.
Oh, no, I did that.
You did that, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, nobody, young people have no concept.
I did that.
Hours and hours and hours, hours and hours and hours of work in a library to do all that research. But, I loved that experience of working in that department. The other thing that I did in that role was I did interlibrary loan, which, do you have a concept of what that is?
I do, but maybe explain it here.
Okay,
I
if
do.
if the library did not have a book that some researcher wanted to use, then we would make the effort to find it at another library in the state, closest to us if possible. And if we couldn't find it, then we would start looking for it in national libraries to see if we could find a copy that could be borrowed. Sometimes libraries would lend something that could only be used on our premises. They had to do all their work with the book still there in our library. But often they would let somebody, take a book home and use it. And we could request extension periods on their loan periods that they granted if they were needed. But I loved just knowing what people were researching, and I loved looking for these things that were hard to find, and I loved the relationships that I built with librarians in other libraries because sort of the same group of people we were always talking to. And since we're on that topic, Georgia is a phenomenal state for cooperation on many, many things, but the cooperation between libraries was sort of in its not quite its infant stages, but maybe its toddler stages when I was doing that work. And in fact, while I was in school at Emory, there was something going on in the basement of the building where the library school was. And I got a whiff of it, and so here's what's going on. They were building the Athens-Atlanta Union Catalog, and all the major university campuses in Atlanta and Athens were contributing a catalog card with a title on it to be filed in a union catalog of all those catalogs in the basement of Emory University's library school. And that was the first place you went when you were looking for something to borrow on interlibrary loan, because all the universities couldn't afford to buy everything they wanted to buy, and they agreed that this would be a way to make their resources go further. Work together. And that was before we had OCLC and the WorldCat, which now you can go to WorldCat, from Google and look for something and find it if it's in, 10,000 libraries all over the world in whatever language you want. But that was how they started. And then...
and this was in the mid-70s.
Yes, in the mid-70s. And then gradually, at that point in time, academic libraries did not associate with public libraries, and they did not associate with school libraries. I mean, that was unheard of. I mean, everybody was in their own little silo. Well, what we started doing in Georgia was breaking down those silos, and now we have all sorts of cooperative ventures. Galileo for buying databases, and just unbelievable cooperation. And that's one of the reasons I love my state, because that carries over in so many different kinds of disciplines in Georgia to make the resources that we have go further and make them more available to every kind of population that we have here.
That's wonderful.
We're great at that. Great at that. We're still a lot better than a lot of other states.
That's wonderful.
I mean, really, we are. I'm very proud of us. Now, one of the things I'm proud of is that we have something that's called GANCH. It's the Georgia Natural, Cultural, and Historical online directory. And for all 159 counties in this state, we have all of the cultural and historical entities that we could identify I think they did a year or two worth of research, and it's still being added to as people find museums or something that have been left out. Um, for all of those 159 counties, we can tell you with GIS coordinates where those places are if we have a disaster in any one of those places. So somebody, the first responders and the law enforcement people can go and check them to see what kind of shape they're in, you know, even if it's a Katrina level disaster. And we're so proud of that.
What an amazing
As far as I know, there is no other state in the United States that has a directory like that. It's not foolproof. I mean, we have some problems with it, but it has well over 2,000 entries in it. And that's been developed within the last 5 or 6, 7 years. You know, that's been a recent project.
Sounds fantastic.
I mean, that's the way people in Georgia think, and you know, and that's wonderful.
And working together in this way.
So, what was the original question you asked me? How did I get attracted to library workshop?
Well, actually, I think that was probably the original question, but I think if we can go to, like, you were in Atlanta, right, working for the Atlanta Public Library. I was looking at your resume, right, from 1974 to 77.
Right.
And then you became coordinator of the Chatham County Library Extension Services.
Right, back here in Savannah.
Back in Savannah.
Back
So
in
what brought
Savannah.
you back to Savannah?
It was a combination of things. I've always called it sort of divine providence. You know, they called me and asked me if I'd be willing to interview for a job because they knew I was in Atlanta. You know, the people that I had worked with in the library system, some of them were still there. And so I did not have the intention to return to Savannah. I really liked Atlanta. I liked the activity with the Atlanta. We had a professional library association in Atlanta, and we were, you know, a lot of the people were real active in the Georgia Library Association. So it was just, you know, there were a lot of attractive things about being in the larger metropolitan area. And I always had thought that it's better to work in a large institution straight out of school than a smaller one, because you get exposed to much more that is part of the whole profession of working in libraries. So I was really glad to have had that. But and I came and interviewed, and I really didn't have the intention of, you know, taking the job. And I wasn't sure they would give it to me. I didn't tell you this part of my I didn't tell you this part of my story when I was in college. In the summers, I worked full time. And so the first time that I applied for one of the full-time jobs for the summer, I was asked if I could drive a stick shift vehicle because they had bookmobiles and they needed bookmobile drivers. I had never driven a stick shift, and I lied outright. I just said, "Yes, ma'am, I can." And a week later, I was supposed to start to work. It wasn't uh-oh, you're exactly right. My mother had nobody owned a stick shift car at that point except my mother, who had never wanted to give up her little stick shifts, what'd you call them? Station wagon. She had a little stick shift station wagon that she hauled the kids around in forever and ever. Amen. And so I asked my boyfriend, my husband now, if he could teach me to drive a stick shift car because he had learned to drive on a stick shift. So he said, yeah. So we drove out into the country somewhere where there was this little church, and there was, you know, a lot of space there. And he proceeded to teach me how to drive a stick shift, and it was, I'm surprised that the relationship survived that experience. It was quite terrible. But I finally got to the point where I could use a clutch and shift gears if we weren't on a hill. You know, being on a hill was really bad, and there aren't too many hills in Savannah, so that worked out pretty good. So, so they put me in these bookmobiles to drive bookmobiles, all these routes where we now have branch libraries, but at that point there were no branch libraries. You know, all they had was the bookmobile. And I did that for a summer and loved it, you know, except that it was this truck that had a 4-on-the-floor shift, and I was about the same size I am now, not very tall. I could barely reach the clutch sitting on the front edge of the seat. And I had a couple of not so fortunate experiences. One of them was the lady who was with me, who'd been a driver and a bookmobile librarian for years. she said, when you go down certain streets, you need to slow down because they're hilly. And if you, kind of like this, and if you don't slow down, you'll throw all the books off the shelves. Which is true. I found out the hard way. It was true. And the particular afternoon that I did it, it was like a Friday afternoon, and I had something I wanted to do that evening. I can't even remember. And we were late getting back, and so I was in a hurry, as young people typically are, and I threw off every single book in the bookmobile. So when I got back to the library, I had to reshelve every single book in the bookmobile before I could go home.
And this was when you were in college.
This is when I was in college. I should have known better by then. I mean, come on. But anyway, and the other experience I had was one time I had to go pick up one of the bookmobiles that had been in a big truck maintenance shop somewhere to be worked on, because that's where you had to take them to get them worked on. Well, it just so happened that this yard outside this maintenance place was all dirt and potholes, and there was a very nice sized pothole full of water right where the dirt lot came onto the paved highway, and there was no way to get out except to drive through it. So I started into this hole, and I had a little problem. At that point, I had never used the low gear, so I didn't know it was there, for one thing. And I was by myself. And here's what happened. I just rocked that bookmobile. Fortunately, it was empty, but I rocked it back until I was just drenched with sweat trying to get it up out of that hole onto the highway. Meanwhile, all the mechanics in this maintenance shop had come outside to watch the show.
I thought it was hilarious.
They thought it was hilarious. I mean, they were just dying with laughter. Finally, one of them came up to the side of the car and he said, "Do you know about the low gear?" And I said, "No, I only know about the first." I said, "If it's one of the first three, I know about it. If it's not, no, I don't know about it." He said, "Well, let me show you." So he showed me, and then I proceeded very slowly to pull that bookmobile up out of the hole. But everything is a learning experience. I avoided potholes from then on. And at one point after I had a child, I owned a stick shift car, and I knew how to get up the hills and down the hills, no problem.
I'm sure you did. So wait, take us back to, in 1977, you took this job back in Savannah.
Yes.
Coordinating Chatham County Library Extension Services. And that was what you had gone back to college in the bookmobile. So tell me how it relates to when you took the coordinator job back in Savannah.
Okay, well, first of all, the ladies who were working in that department at the time were very experienced. All of them could have been my mother.
Okay.
So they weren't real excited about the fact that this youngster, who they remembered had thrown books off the hill, was going to be their supervisor now.
Yeah.
So I treaded very lightly on a lot of things because I like these people, and they were friends of mine.
Yeah.
So that was a good experience in learning how not to strut your stuff in an environment where you shouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
I guess I would say. But that was also the period where they were beginning to try to get branches built in some of these communities where they were so badly needed. They were trying to phase out bookmobiles. And so I had the opportunity to go and give presentations on what libraries, when you had a library in your immediate vicinity, all the things that it could offer for your students and your families and your people who needed a place to meet, because they all built them with meeting rooms. And so I did a lot of outreach, I guess is what you would call it now, outreach, trying to build support for the referendums that they needed for the special purpose local option sales tax, or whatever this funding source was going to be. Let's get the vote out and get this done in your community. I went to talk to the Rotary clubs and the JCs and the Kiwanis and whoever I could talk to. Occasionally I went to a church and talked to the people in their men's group or their women's group or something to help them build a community support to say, yes, we go to the county commissioners and tell them we want the funding for this, so we can build branches. Pooler was one of the first ones we built, is my recollection. And they had a little library that they were running in a former house. It had been somebody's home.
Interesting.
And then I can't really, we built one at Tybee. We got the one for Tybee
Okay.
Island while I was there. Port Wentworth had a little corner of their one of their civic buildings that they were using as a library. I did some work out there.
Interesting.
You know, it was just, that was part of what that job was at that point,
Right.
was to see if we could
Expand.
the
Okay,
the footprints in actual buildings and start phasing out the bookmobiles, so making
Okay.
that transition. So there are very few libraries now that have bookmobiles, unless they sort of use them like for festivals. You know, it's brightly colored,
Right.
and they'll take
Attract
somebody
attention.
and they'll do a story time outside and that sort of thing. And I did some of that too right at the end of my period with them when we were we had a children's book festival,
Mhm.
you know, and so they wanted somebody to go. And at one time I went in costume, and it was freezing cold. I had to go rent a cape from a costume place because the costume that I had was for summer weather, and I was freezing to death. So, but anyway, you know, that's what we did then.
And so you were there from 77 to 78, and then you came to work in the city manager's office, right? Starting in late 1978. What?
Well, I had always been kind of interested in who these special libraries were because, you know, I had worked, and my experience was in mainstream libraries.
Mhm.
Oh, and when I was at Emory, I was working as an assistantship in the big Woodruff Library there. And what I was doing was filing, I can't remember what those things were called. Maybe they were called P-slips or something like that. They got paper copies of everything that the Library of Congress was receiving into
Okay.
their collections, and
Okay.
then they made their choices of what they wanted to purchase from those. And so
Okay.
I was handling those when I was doing that assistantship, which was very interesting as well. You know, we got a medical school and a business school and all these specialized schools, so I saw a lot of literature, you know, in those titles that I
Mhm.
didn't have any familiarity with. But anyway, special libraries were always of interest to me because they, you know, they worked for a particular company like the Coca-Cola company, or they worked for the railroads, or they worked for a particular government department, like maybe the Department of Transportation, or, you know, they worked for all sorts of companies. And I didn't know anything about them, you know, really. I didn't know, what do you do? You know, because you don't have kids coming in and all
Yeah.
that stuff. So I saw this job announcement, and it just sounded interesting. I mainly went to the interview because I wanted to find out, what are they doing? You know, what's going on here? And the job was advertised as a part-time job, and so one of the things I had to say at the interview was, I'm not interested in a part-time job. You know, my husband and I are trying to pay for cars and buy a house and all that stuff, and I said, no, I don't want a part-time job. You know, is there any chance there's enough work here for a full-time job? Well, you know, he hemmed and hawed about that. I was interviewing with the city manager because their little library was part of his suite of offices, and mainly he wanted somebody to do work for him,
Okay.
for his research on various topics. And let's see, I think I interviewed like in November or sometime in the fall, and he wanted somebody to come to work pronto, and I found out the reason for that later. But I said, well, I could come and work on Saturdays. I had not seen their library. All I'd done is talk to him in this interview situation. He said, that would be great.
Huh.
Okay. And so, you know, a week or so later, I got a call from their human resources department, personnel department. They had decided to make the job full-time, and this was the beginning salary. I had to tell him what I was making, you know, when I interviewed, and it was a fairly substantial raise. It was nice, you know. And so I thought, okay, I think I'll try it. I'll just see what goes on here, you know. Well, when I showed up on the first Saturday and opened the door to this room that was their library, the room was stacked. The entire floor, the tables, the desk, stacked with boxes of books and issues of magazines and bill invoices that
So it
needed
was
to
a
be
mess.
paid for subscriptions. They had somebody part-time, evidently, that left several months later or several months previous.
Right.
And during that period, nobody had touched anything that came addressed to the municipal library. It just stacked up in there.
Yeah.
And I thought, what are these people thinking about? I've never been into any place. I worked for a bank one summer when I was in undergraduate. When I was at Armstrong, in the credit department. And I mean, everything got filed every day.
Yeah.
You know, everything was so
Yeah.
precise. And I thought, what is going on here? But anyway, then I spent the 4 Saturdays of December just opening boxes and finding out what all their periodical subscriptions were and putting them in the piles, and just finding out what on earth is going on here, stacking all the bills that hadn't been paid for subscriptions or anything in piles, and and then I could get to the shelves to see what was on the shelves in the library. And it was a combination of reference books that related to the various functions of a local government, that has a water department and a fire department and a police department and a social services department and management and finance and personnel, and there was that stuff. And then there were a lot of documents that had been done by different city departments, and without being cataloged in any way, they were just on the shelves. And if you went in and looked for one if you wanted one. And then there were all these books of the state statutes that come out every year after the legislative session, so you could see what the laws were, exactly how they read, all that stuff. And that's about all. And there were old copies of the city codes going back as far as a printed city code had been issued.
Wow.
And I can't remember how far back they were, but they were way far
Old.
back, very old. And that was how we started, was just, and what he wanted me to do, and I'll tell you this story. Author A. Don Mendonza was a phenomenal city manager. I mean, absolutely extraordinary. And one of the things I found out real quickly was that he came to the city hall on Sunday afternoons, parked his little nondescript sedan out front, because then there was not a traffic lane there. You could park a car in front of City Hall. And he spent the afternoon reading.
Wow.
He read journals, he read newspapers, he read books. And I would come into work on Monday morning, and my desk would be stacked about this high with the things he had read. And he would put notes in them. If somebody referenced something that he wanted to read, he'd say, "Get this." That's what the note would say, "Get this." Others of them, he would just put something in the tab the page in some way, and there would be notes in the margin where he had argued with the person who was writing the article, and he would say, "This is not what he said back on page so and so," And then we'd get to the end, and there would be a bibliography or something there, a citation, and then he would say, "Get this." And I thought, he must spend his entire Sunday afternoon after he has lunch until it's dark right here in this, sitting in here reading all this stuff. But that would be what I did for the first 1 or 2 days of the week. And what he actually wanted me to do was, they were working on upgrading the effectiveness and the efficiency of the operating departments. He wanted them to become more professional. And so he would have me do research projects on whatever project so-and-so department was working on, give that to them from their own disciplines literature, give it to him, and then when they came to talk to him about something they wanted done, he knew a great deal about what was going on. He had been an urban planner. He started out with the Chatham Savannah Metropolitan Planning Commission as a planner and became the city manager. And that was principally what I did for a couple of years, was just research on all sorts of topics. And I think you had a question that you let me see about things that I was most proud of working with the city. One of them was that at some point in there, I can't quite place it in time correctly, the foundation that's associated with UPS, the United Parcel Service, I think the name of it was the Annie Casey Foundation.
Yes.
They were giving grants to cities, or to anybody, I guess, that applied, to try to address the problems of kids dropping out of high school, girls having babies out of wedlock as teenagers, and them not being able to find any work as teenagers so they could make some money to help contribute to all the financial needs that come when you get to that age within a family, and if you're trying to, think about going to college and improve your educational credentials. And so he just basically he said, I want you to do research on all three of these areas and find everything you can find out about it. And we were still doing research in periodical indexes in those days too. There were no databases.
Yeah.
So that's what I did for probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 months, maybe longer than that. And I put together these huge notebooks, 3-ring binders of literature on each of those subjects. And one of the funny things it happened more than once, but the first time it happened, it really startled me. I would see if there was anybody identified in the articles that I might could call to ask to give me any of their operating documents. What kind of intake documents did they have for their kids? What kind of flyers did they have about events that they held to get kids to come, and whatever. And I would make a call, and somebody would say, I'm on the panel to review the applications for that grant program. And the first time it happened, I stopped and I thought, oh my goodness. And I said, well, I guess I shouldn't be talking to you. And he said, no, actually, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah,
You're
keep talking.
You're talking to me because you're looking for the research that we've already issued about how this worked and how it didn't work. And the group that was formed to carry out the grant after we got it was the Youth Futures Authority. And I was always really glad that the work that I had done, to help them put together how they were going to structure that program in Savannah, it helped a lot of kids in Savannah have a better future. I mean, and get a job and maybe not have a baby until they were ready to financially and emotionally and educationally to be able to give them a better future than they might have had otherwise. So that was really a very, very rewarding thing.
That's wonderful.
It really was. And then how did we go from doing mostly research and work with the departments? And what happened was, over time, I could get them to join the professional organizations they needed to be a part of, and get the literature that they published, so that they could do more of what I had been doing for them themselves.
Right.
And that was about the time that Logan Local Government Information Network was being put together by the National League of Cities, and the International City Management Association had some networking kinds of resources that we could get. That was about the time they came into being, and I could send them things that we got from those places and say, this might be somebody you want to talk to about something. They weren't real receptive to the idea that they should look at the requests that were posted on those networks and occasionally respond to them, because they might have something useful to say, because that took their work time.
Okay.
And this was really the time when the city government was becoming more professional. Up until that time, Savannah had not had financial resources to pay competitive salaries and that sort of thing. And even then, I remember my early years working with the city. Our computer director, our information technology director, was always saying, the only thing I'm able to do in this department is train people to be hired away by every other company in this city who can afford to pay them so much more than I can. And that was what he was doing for a long time. He was exactly right. And he was always begging for better salaries for his staff. But that was true for every department. I mean, we had a lot of really good people that left after they, had started their careers or something, because they could get better salaries. And Don Mendonza was the person who, are you familiar with the financial background of Savannah by any chance? Probably.
A little bit, but not, why don't you talk about that?
Okay.
And by the way, I think what we should do is, I want you to talk about this, and then I think we should take a little break.
Okay.
And continue on. So keep going.
Okay, so one of the things we did along the way in Savannah was develop an in-house training program, or more of an in-house training program for all types of employees. And so one of the things I got tasked with was teaching them a little bit about Savannah government's history. And one of the big stories was what happened to Savannah financially in the Civil War and after the Civil War, because of course the economy here was devastated. I mean, it was just, it just disappeared. Savannah had been a city on par with Philadelphia and Baltimore and New York and other places up the East Coast, and all of a sudden we were nothing. Well, our government was a mayor committee form of government, and there were still people who were very progressive here at the turn of the century in the first decade of the 1900s. That was the progressive city movement. They were paving streets, they were putting in sewer systems, they were doing all these things, and Savannah wanted to do that too. So they developed a bad habit of borrowing money that they couldn't pay back. And so what they did for a number of decades was, this is not a technical financial explanation, but it worked when I'm explaining it to the average administrative assistant who's hired in a department or somebody. What they did was they would issue bonds, and then when it came time to pay them off, they would issue some more or borrow some more money and use that money to pay on the first one. And then they did it over and over again with various development schemes, most of which were not particularly successful. There's actually been a book written about it by Dr. Lisa L. Denmark. It may be titled Savannah's Midnight Hour or something like that, where she talks about this whole cascade of things that happened over a number of decades that got the city into really, really bad debt. But the idea was Savannah wanted to keep up, and they wanted to remain a progressive, successful city. But then all this debt was building up that they were paying off with more debt. And the way I explained it when I did this training to just your general audience was, it would be like me taking out a credit card, running it up to its limit, and then taking out another credit card to charge enough to make payments on this one, and just keep doing that over and over again. And that's what was happening. So when Don Mendonza became city manager, there were several city managers that preceded him. But in the 1950s, I think it was 1954, the city was going to the banks asking for enough money to make payroll. And the banks got together and other civic interest in Savannah and said, this has got to stop. This is not the way our community should be run. And so that was the point in time at which a lot of cities were adopting council manager form of government. So the city manager or the county manager or whoever the manager is, he's responsible for running the operations. The elected body makes policy, and he figures out how to make it work. So that was, there were a few city managers before him, but when they hit him, they hit somebody with the backbone to say things are going to change. And so he spent his entire career working with the financial team here, and we had a fantastic finance director when I was a part of our employment, whose name was Richard A. Evans. We all know him as Dick. And a fantastic hydraulic engineer who was running our water and sewer department, and who knew that our stewardship of water was a way for us to help, stabilize the financial system of our city government. And they started paying off all these debts, some of which went back into the late 1800s, And they finally achieved pretty much freedom from all of that past debt in the early 1980s. And that was when Savannah began to take off, addressing new needs. And one of the programs that Don started that, was part of the reason he was named City Manager of the Year or something by the ICMA Association, along in there somewhere, he developed a program called Responsive Public Services. Responsive Public Services Program. It was RPSP. And he did long-range plans for all of these miles of streets in Savannah that were still dirt, primarily in disadvantaged minority neighborhoods. He developed a schedule for how much of it we're going to pave every year. We're going to pay what we could pay for, and we're going to put in sidewalks and sewers and curbs, all of that stuff that goes along. And he started working on it. And there were a lot of people who didn't like that. They wanted to be able to come knock on the mayor's door and get the mayor to go upstairs and talk to the city manager and get the money for whatever they wanted for their little project, for their own project in their own neighborhood. And they were all good projects. I mean, there are very few projects that are asked for that aren't worthwhile. But we all have to live within our means, right?
Or we should.
So we should. So for the time that I was there, particularly in the latter years, you know, Savannah had excellent bond ratings, way up there, AA, double plus. You know, we never borrowed, we never issued bonds that we weren't in a position to get paid back on the schedule that had been agreed to. And that's how it worked from then on. And we didn't hire people. You know, the other thing that was going on in Savannah when we had mayor committee form of government was, you know, if you knew somebody in City Hall and you needed a job, you went to talk to somebody in the personnel department and you got a job, whether there was a job there or not. Put a stop to that. And, you know, and then just generally broadening our searches for positions. You know, Savannah always does national searches. And it started during the time that I was working for the city. You know, you go out and you look for the best. And the other thing that was happening along in there too was we decided that we wanted to become an ISO certified city, quality. So the emphasis was on quality and involving everybody in your operation to contribute good ideas, the way we could do things better, which was a great incentive for people who were not professional leadership within the organization to feel like their contributions were important. I mean, there was really a lot of team camaraderie being built. When I started working for the city, departments felt like they were competing against each other for everything they got to try to do what they were supposed to do, and there was not a collective spirit. So that improved greatly because we began to work across departments to effect better solutions to problems that really were the problem of more than one department. You had to look at them from different perspectives. And one of the things that we did when we started that was we developed a little pamphlet. It was not very attractive, you know, we just did what we could do in-house. But we talked about the fact that Savannah was a multifaceted municipal corporation and that we had all these different kinds of products and services that we delivered, you know, where some companies can specialize and just deliver what they want to, and they can focus on developing the best of that one product or service. We have to try to provide the best of all of these services, and we don't get to have a target consumer. We serve everybody, you know, and that's the concept. Those were the kind of concepts we were trying to get developed, and so those were the kind of concepts that I developed in our, you know, the training that I was responsible for doing.
And was this the kind of thing you're talking about right now, was this in your earliest years at the city? So I know you were at the city from late 1978 to 2011.
Yeah, it was more in the middle years.
In the middle years.
As we began to have finances available to do something other than just the bare minimum of what had to be done all the time. And when we were getting more professional people to come into our positions so that they knew what they were responsible for trying to do. You know, it wasn't just maintaining what was already there. It was trying to build something that was structured better for the future, for now and the future.
So what I think we should do now is take a little break.
Okay.
And then when we come back, I want to hear the story of how the Municipal Archives came to be. Your baby. And
my baby.
One of your babies. And I'd like to hear about that. So let's take a break now and then come back.
Okay.
This is Laura Ettinger back with Glenda Anderson for part 2 of our interview. And as I mentioned before, I wanted to have you talk about the story of how the Municipal Archives came to be.
Okay, all right, that's a good story. Over a number of years in the making. I think what really started it was that the state of Georgia passed some records management legislation for the state. And that was the period when that was happening in a number of states. You know, records management really became an area of professional interest after World War II, of course, because there were so many service records that had to be appropriately maintained with appropriate finding aids and things so that people could get to that information. You know, they were writing histories of regular units, they were looking for records on loved ones, all of that stuff. So then, you know, the federal government departments initially adopted records management practices, then the state got into it, and then in the early 80s, they passed some records management laws at the state level that applied to municipal and county governments. And our city manager always said, this is what you call an unfunded mandate. They tell us we have to do this, but they don't provide any funds for us to do it with. Okay, nonetheless, you know, when they said we're having training at the state archives in Atlanta for people to begin to understand how you do records management, he sent me, you know, and I went. Okay, so I found out about records management. I thought, oh my goodness, I think, you know, we're not doing any of this anywhere. So I started trying to learn how to do that, and I went downstairs to the basement level of City Hall, which had been intentionally built as a space to store records in. And primarily they were using metal cabinets with Hollinger-sized drawer boxes in them, and they were saving the folded up records of what happened at city council meetings. They were saving reports and resolutions and so forth. But over the years, the city government had outgrown what was originally the way that place was organized. And you walked into this space that had 3 major rooms, each probably about 25 feet long and maybe 18 to 20 feet deep. And they were piled high with no aisles of just boxes, where somebody in this building or other buildings had said, take these boxes and put them in the records space at City Hall. Not a lot of them were not labeled. It was the biggest mess you had ever seen. I had never seen anything that looked like it. And the first time I saw it, I said, at that point, what had been the doors for the vault, there were big metal doors, they had been blocked with asphalt on the floor so that they couldn't be closed. They had to stay open all the time. And it was probably that they either lost the combination for the lock or they lost the keys or whatever, so they made sure that it couldn't be closed. But I said, we have got to get some kind of door on this space. I said, somebody from the press is going to come by this, go in here and take a picture of this, and everybody, and put it in the newspaper, and everybody that works in here is going to lose their job. This is negligence like I've never seen before. So at that point, they first had somebody from the auditing department go through and try to find boxes of things like accounts receivable, accounts payables that could be gotten rid of because they were 20 years old, you know, that kind of thing. And then when they kind of cleared it so that somebody else could walk in there, then they said, you know, the librarian is the person to send down there to see what we could, see what we have and see if we can do something with it. So that was when I got involved with records management, which led to archival practice, because archival records are those that have to be retained permanently because they have some kind of enduring value, be it historical or administrative, you know, with the governance of the entity or whatever. And so that's when I started working on that, and I didn't have a budget for it, so initially we bought shelving, you know, heavy metal, appropriate shelving to hold the weight of filled boxes. That was coated steel, you know. I think we brought 18 gauge steel shelving, and we got one room shelved properly so that we could store uniform letter legal size containers on it, or the archival boxes. And gradually we replaced all of the original shelving in those rooms, except some really nice roller shelving that holds the last tax records that the city did before that function was totally transferred to county government. And we kept one section of the original metal drawers, but we didn't use them to put records in after we got the records out of them and flattened them, you know, opened them and flattened them and so forth. And I had a few part-time employees that helped do some of that through the years. But it was sort of a clandestine kind of operation for a while, that this just needs to be cleaned up and get some organization. And then at some point, before I had gotten involved with that, they had transferred a lot of city records as it began to fill up at the space, and they just didn't have any more room to put anything in there. They cleaned out some records and sent them to the Georgia Historical Society, which is now a totally private operation. But at that point in time, they had some government funding from the state of Georgia, and were sort of considered an auxiliary state location for public records, government records. And so they were transferred over there. And there was some minimal finding aids prepared for them, but not really enough that they could be very helpful to researchers. And so they sat there for a long time while we worked on the stuff that was already there, still there in City Hall. And then at some point, the National Historical Records Publications Commission, which is part of the National Archives, they had a grant program where you could apply for grants to arrange and describe records and make them more accessible to the public, do good inventories, good finding aids. And so those were administered through what are called state SHRABs, State Historical Historical Records Advisory Boards, SHRABs. And we had one in Georgia, and at that time we had a very energetic state archives director who really wanted to try to get this program underway in Georgia. And so he was reaching out to anybody he could find in any county or municipal government and doing training at the state archives in good records management practices. And then if you did that, you were eligible to apply for one of the re-grants that they were administering. Part of the reason they were formed was to administer grants that the national organization wanted to give to the states to re-grant. And so we were able to get some re-grant, a couple of re-grants. And they did a grant writing workshop too, to teach people how to follow the instructions that were in the, the grant solicitation. Some people just, didn't read those, and they didn't follow them very well, but they taught you what you should do. So I went to their grant writing workshop. I went to their workshop on basic records management practices. I went to their workshop on basic emergency plan practices. That was when we wrote the first emergency plan for the archives, that starts off with do an inventory of your collections, know what you have, and then prioritize your collections. What is the top tier, the most important ones for whatever reason, secondary, tertiary, so that you know what to evacuate or what to try to save or what to try to restore after a disaster. So we did all of that kind of stuff to apply for the grants. And I think we got either 2 or 3 fairly small grants at the end of the 90s, maybe the middle to the end of the 90s was when they had those grants becoming available. And we applied, and we could do things like buy flat files or maps, which we had, by that time, the engineering department had found out that we were organizing things and getting junk out of places, and they had junk everywhere. So they wanted us to come and take their historical maps that they didn't have to refer to very often, but occasionally they did. So we could get flat file cabinets and the big folders to put big oversized maps in. So that's kind of how it all started. We got involved with the state nudge to, we have a new state ordinance now that's part of the Georgia Code, and we really want you to do this. Whether the state legislature gives her any money to hire anybody to do it or to buy any boxes with or anything, that's not important. You still have to try to comply.
So you said when you began there was no budget, and you had part-time people helping you.
Interns or something like that every once in a while, yeah.
When did you have more than that?
During the time I worked for the city, never. I was asked to write a strategic plan in 1985, and at that point I wrote a plan that said this department has 3 responsibilities. We have research library responsibilities, we have records management responsibilities, and records management, the state issues retention schedules, specific periods of time for which records should be kept after they're generated, and then they're supposed to be destroyed. For most records management, that's what they handle. Anything that has a retention period that's permanent, then that becomes archival, because that's what archival records are permanent records. And so we have three functions, and I said we need three professional people to manage this. We need a research librarian, we need a records manager, and we need an archivist.
And you never had that during your time?
Well, I should take that back. That's not accurate, because Luciana Spraker came onto my radar. Gosh, I wish I could remember the time period, exactly when it was. She had graduated with a degree in public history, and she had started a private business that was called Bricks and Bones Research. I just love that. And she could do, researches on your historical house if you wanted that done. She could do, if you had a whole body of family records that you wanted some control established over, you wanted them housed correctly in the right kind of folders and boxes, and you wanted some sort of finding aid generated to what was where about who and what, then an archivist is the person you want. And so she was running a little private business. And I can't remember exactly if we brought her on board to do a specific project. I wish I could. It might have been something to do with one of the World War shipyards down on the waterfront or something like that. I can't remember what we hired her to do a project. And when that was over, I said, and she made it very clear to me that when we first met that she intended to maintain her private business. We were just a client like anybody else. And so she did that project and maybe another one for us, and I thought, this is a really good person here. And so I had this conversation with her, and I said, I know you said you want to maintain your private business. I said, would you at all be interested in entertaining the notion of joining the staff as an archivist? And she was interested in getting good credentials in her field, so she was doing the Certified Archivist program, which is a national program that you go through, and then you can put CA behind your name if you complete it successfully. And I think about that same time, she was still working for us part-time, but she also decided to teach a graduate course in history at Armstrong. And she was just mortified at what happened with that group of students, because here they were, people who were majoring in history, and so she was asking them to do meaningful personal, research and produce meaningful product. And the majority of her class were not interested. They didn't want to do that. They were not happy at what she was asking them to do, and they complained a lot about it. And she said, these are people who are supposed to love history. They're supposed to be going to make this their life's work, and they're complaining about everything I ask them to do. So she very quickly decided that she didn't want to do. I think that's the only academic course she's ever taught. There might have been another one, but I think that's the only one. She was so upset that these people who claimed this was their field didn't want to do any of the academic work to learn the skills to do it. So she decided, she would try us for a while. So she came on board, and somewhere along in there about the same time, the Georgia Historical Society decided that they needed to up their cost for the records that they were holding that they didn't own, and they could not legally own government records because those will always belong to the public. They couldn't be theirs. So we got their schedule of how much the fees were going to be and how much they were going to increase every year, which was fairly substantial. And I plotted that out. If we didn't add any more records, just the ones that were there, what was that going to cost us over a 20-year period? And I took it to our assistant city manager, and I said, we could buy a building of our own for what this is going to cost us. I said, we need to get those records back under our jurisdiction, because we have somebody now who can find real thorough finding aids for them, and they had not been able to do that at Georgia Historical. So they had these very rudimentary finding aids that weren't enough for researchers' needs. And so we brought those records back to City Hall sometime along the way, not too long after she started, I think. And she worked with those and just did fantastic finding aids for them. And then we also had a number of research projects that had to be done during that period. The City Hall reached its 100th anniversary, and so she did a whole, several months of research on the construction of City Hall and all that stuff, and we still have that document that she wrote. And then somewhere along the line, there was a need or a desire to put up a lasting World War II monument to the veterans from Chatham County in our community. And we needed to research who those veterans were, so we needed to get their veterans records from the National Veterans Records Center, some of which we could get and some of which we couldn't get because they had a bad fire somewhere along the way and lost a lot of records. But almost completely we were able to document every single veteran whose name was going to go on that monument, and she did most of that work, researching those people and pulling that together. Just did a fabulous job. And then along there somewhere, we began to do succession planning in the city because we realized that there was this huge group of us who were all sort of the same generation. So over a 5 to 10 year period, we were going to lose all the experienced leadership that had been part of bringing the city into its professional maturity. I'll say it that way. And we were all, this is awful. We got to do something about this. We can't let this happen because we want these younger people to have the knowledge to deal with things that they get hit with. So we started a succession planning effort, and everybody would bring somebody that was sort of like their second in command or their new hire that they had just hired for a second in command position. They started coming to all the management meetings. The Management Services Bureau had a meeting every Friday, and they came. And they were big. We were trying to get them more involved in the bigger picture of what all of city government was about and how we made our cooperation work, if you want to call it that, internally, and how the financial system was designed to keep us really stable so that everybody's never going to get everything they want in their budget because we stay within the tracks, to keep the government stable. And then we hit the recession of 2008. Remember the recession of 2008? Okay, so, we started off, and anybody that left, their position wasn't filled. No new positions were created or filled. Anybody that retired, their position wasn't filled. And, we took budget cuts on all the line item budgets, anything that wasn't essential, that was nice but not essential, went. And we did that for 2008, 2009, 2010. Well, when it got time to start preparing the 2011 budget, our finance director came and he said, okay, we've gotten all the blood we can get out of the turnip, doing everything we've done so far. Now here's what's got to happen. Some of you have got to retire, or you've got to let your staff go that were your hires since we started our succession planning. And all of us just went, you gotta be kidding. I mean, no, we can't do this. And so we had people, in those positions that he put together a little bit of a severance package for us.
And he,
finance director, put together a little finance package. If you're, able to retire and can, and leave your rest of your staff intact without having to do any, reductions in force and getting rid of positions of people, then we'll do as much of it as we can this way. And I was 60 years old and had planned to work till 66 or 67 anyway, so I'd get the maximum Social Security. And we also had started a capital improvement fund in, I think, 2004, where we were slowly building the capital that we would need to build a really good archival facility, or records management archival facility. because we have, even if you talk to Luciana now, she has parts of her collection stored all over in different places around the city. And our records management for short-term retention records, anything up to 25 years, we actually do a commercial contract with a commercial records center, so that it goes there and it's not in city facilities at all. But we had started that capital improvement, and my goal was to stay until I saw that realized. But when when I talked to the budget director, who was, over those capital improvements, she was getting ready to take the package and leave, and she was fairly, below 65. We were a lot of us were below 65. Some of us were over 65. And I said, if I stay, will this grow fast enough for me to be able to do it, before I reach the age where I want to retire? She said no. So I thought of, I had a child. My house was paid for. I had a child who had graduated from college, and we had already paid for her wedding. And I had Luciana, who had a young child, and still a house payment and all that stuff. And I said, I can't do it. I just can't do it. I can't fire her. So that's what I did. And then that was 2011, and I had worked on the state archivist with a number of things through the years. He actually wrote a training program for public records managers, people in government agencies, and I can't remember the titles. It was a 2-part thing that he developed for FEMA, under contract with FEMA, and I helped him test the beta version of it. I took all the training of the beta version so we could look for things that might need to be better explained or differently explained or whatever. It's a great product. And he was able to promote it until he left the state archives in 2012, was when they were taking drastic measures to balance the budget at the state level. And they were going to cut his staff down to 3 people in the state archives. Huge facility. And anyway, he took another job as the state archivist in Pennsylvania. He was the archivist who was in place when we built the current new Georgia State Archives facility. And he went to Pennsylvania and did the same thing there before he retired. But anyway, I had grown close to him, so he said, there's a vacancy coming up on the Georgia Historical Records Advisory Board. Can I nominate you? So he did. And I sort of entered my current 15-year career place by working in the state archives. And I love the things we do. Our main 2 programs are, we give awards every year, and we give them for professional history, people who write books and publish books, and we give them for academic students, undergraduate and graduate, and we give them for grade school projects, middle school through high school. So, we take nominations every year, and then we, have peer review panels that review the work, and then the board reviews it, and we give awards every year to just broaden. Our state archivist, David Carmichael, who left, in 2012, he was very interested in establishing closer relationships between archivists and legislators, so that when it came time to make cuts, they would know more about how important archives are to the freedoms that we preserve.
So I'm interested in more about that. If we go back to your work with the Municipal Archives here in Savannah, how did you make the case that this work mattered? I mean, again, you started, as you said, with no budget and some part-time interns, and eventually,
and a lot of suspicion about why do we need a librarian working in local government when we got potholes and traffic signals and all these other things that are needed. Well, I'll give you one example that is a good example. There's a property over on the west side of Savannah that was owned by the U.S. Department of Agriculture for years. It was a laboratory facility, and what they did was they tested all sorts of pesticides that could be used um, in the hulls of cargo ships to get agricultural product out of the port of Savannah and wherever it needed to go in the world, and still be usable when it got to its destination without being contaminated for human consumption. Okay, so they were doing high-level scientific research with some pretty suspicious off products, or things that they were disposing of on the property. So, at some point, they abandoned that facility, and the city bought it, intending to use it. The city used to gobble up abandoned properties all the time because everybody needed more space, and there was very little money to buy facilities. Property in Savannah is very inflated. Property costs are anywhere, even on the west side, which it was cited in a lower advantaged community, of course. That's where they would put something like that. And the city just sat on it for years, and then they decided, that there were some uses. At one point, there was one building on that site that was what's called a reefer. It was a refrigerated building, and they were suggesting that we renovate it as a site for records. And we actually started that process by having a new roof put on it, because that's the first thing the city always did to buildings that they bought, because if you can keep the building dry, you can keep so much deterioration from happening. But we didn't go through with that, because ultimately the police department decided that it would be a great building, an area for their uses. One of the things they were going to do was put a gun range on it, so they could have somewhere to practice their shooting, stay up to certification standards. And I'm not sure what's happening with it right now, but at that point, they were going to have to have some kind of and this, from the time the U.S. Department of Agriculture had, divested themselves of it until the time the city was actually going to use it for something was several decades. And so they were going to have to do some kind of a brownfield study to find out what was in the ground. What had they disposed of in the ground? But somebody in the Facilities Maintenance Bureau found a piece of communication that said that this study had been done at the time that the U.S. Department of Agriculture divested themselves of it, but nobody could find a copy of it. Okay, that old trick of going to the trash cans and pulling things out and saving them wasn't being practiced at that point in time. So they came to me and wanted to know if I could find it. And I did have a title and I did have a date, which was wonderful. Once you have those things, you can just find almost anything. If you have, it had a green cover and it was about this thick. Well, you can forget that. But anyway, so I knew the interlibrary loan librarians at the University of Georgia from having worked with them when I was at the Atlanta Public Library. In fact, the head of their interlibrary loan department was one of my dearest friends for years. I just loved her to death. Anyway, I called her up and I said, is there any place in your libraries where you all maintained agriculture department records? Because I know you have a Department of Agriculture on your campus. And she said, well, we have this, and we have this off-site building where we have U.S. Department of Agriculture things. I said, that's the building I'm looking for. And I gave her the citation. And, a couple of weeks went by because they had to send somebody out to this building that nobody ever goes to, figure out how it's laid out, so they can look for something specific in it. And lo and behold, they found this study. Okay, so it comes back, a period of, 6 weeks, 2 months, something like that went by. And I call them up and say, I have this study, it doesn't need to be redone because it's already been done. Saved the city about close to $500,000, and so we want that copy. In fact, what we did is we made a copy of this thing, and it was big volumes and it was thick, but we copied the whole thing and sent the one back to the U.S. Department of Agricultural Depository on the UGA campus, and we didn't have to pay for that again. So, when that happens, people say, "Oh yeah, this is important." This is definitely important. And so, and the quality initiative that we did, to get our ISO certification, there was a lot of research in that, and a lot that I did to help different departments implement that in their functions and so forth. And I didn't actually go and work with them in their departments, but I gave them the information that they needed to figure out how to do it themselves, how to make it work for their setting. And I kept doing whatever they asked me to do. No matter what it was, I would do it,
Okay, persistent,
No,
yes.
yeah, just never saying, well, that's really not the best use of my time, or,
Yeah.
I can't, you want it yesterday, I can't do it that fast. I've got to have at least 24 or 48 hours, trying to get them, I said, how long have you known you were gonna do this project? And you wait till now to come and ask me, because you're gonna have to talk to city council about it at their next meeting a week from tomorrow or something, why didn't you ask me sooner so I could really do a good job for you? But, in those relationships, when you've been there longer than, some people, they just automatically assume that, that you're gonna do the function you're there for, and so you don't have to fight so hard to establish your legitimacy as being meaningful to the entity. And that's kind of how it worked. I stayed there, and there were some things going on in my personal life during that whole time too that made me not want to be quite so eager to sample other parts of the library and archives and records management fields as I had been in my younger years. Then I didn't care if I changed jobs every 3 years. I was sampling things and finding out things about the profession that I didn't know anything about. But then, my mother developed ovarian cancer and died when she was 59, and I had a 3-year-old child at that point, and that was very devastating to me. Just
So sorry.
yeah, that one of those things that you don't expect to happen. And then when I had my child, I had preeclampsia, and I didn't know it at the time, but I came close to dying, evidently close to having a major stroke. And my doctor used to always say, see this white hair on my head? You put this white hair there, because he didn't want to lose a baby. So there was that, and, just things that happen, and you think, I really want to stay close to the people I can help. When my mother died, I really wanted to be close to my dad, because he had been a tower of strength for all the time I had ever known him, and he just went to pieces. I mean, we went home from work in the afternoon at 5 o'clock, and my dad had been sitting on the curb in front of our house for an hour, and I wanted to give him a key so he could go in. He said, no, I don't want to be in an empty house. And then my husband and I were both working, and, he would want to stay till midnight or 1 o'clock, and we had to get up at 5. It was just, all that stuff that happens that's life. And I thought, well, I like the people I worked with, and I really did. When I would go to parties or any kind of meeting and people were putting down local government, I would stop it. I would say, no, that's not the kind of city government we have here in Savannah. I can vouch for that. I know these people personally. I know what their behavior is like. I know that many of them, their behavior is as Christian as anybody that's written about in the Bible, in terms of how they handle difficult situations, challenging situations. And I know that we're physically sound. We are extremely fiscally sound. So no, we may not do everything you want. We may not do it exactly like you want it done, but this is a highly competent government, and it was. And we had a great group of people working together. That 30 years of my life it was a pleasure to work. Not all the time. I mean, there were things that needled me, of course, but yeah. But we did
amazing.
it. And we haven't talked about the dumpster diving, but the way I built the collections was when people would move from one office to another, one building to another, or they would take a different job, or they would retire. If I could get to their trash cans on the day they left, I could add meaningful resources to our collection, because they just didn't think anybody was going to ever need them again. And inevitably they did. Part of it was it would keep them from redoing work that had already been done, and part of it was just that they needed a better context.
Okay. And how did you provide the better context? Like, how did you,
Yeah, well, they needed the material to know what had preceded them, you know, what had
Yeah.
been done in this neighborhood
I see what you
30
mean.
or 40 years ago, so the
I see.
documents that we were able to save could
Could
prevent
provide
them,
that.
could provide some of that,
Got
not
it.
always all of that, but some of that, and they could keep people from having to do background work that had already been done at some other point in time, you know.
So how, I guess, actually I have a different question. I was gonna go in one direction, but I'm going in another. What would have been lost if this work hadn't been done? One thing is the context that you're talking about. Say more, you know, if people are listening to this who don't really understand that much about what archives do, what might have been lost if this work hadn't been done?
Well, for one thing, I don't think the city government was considered much of a constituents in the whole historic preservation climate in Savannah at that point in time, you know,
Mhm.
because local governments particularly in urban areas are often not very esteemed. You know, they're corrupt, and you know, they give away money when they shouldn't give away money, blah blah blah, all of the typical tropes, you know, that people say about how bad government is. But when we started looking into the history of the buildings that the city has that are in fact historicals, beginning with City Hall, it's a gorgeous building, we have a lot of documentation on it, and telling those stories, then there, you know, it began to be a little more important that you know, the city has a place in the historic preservation fabric of this community, just like every other, you know, historic participant in that thing. And it also was a way of giving our employees more pride in who they were associated with and how they did their jobs, and how they were the eyes and ears of the government to help the city know about places where there were needs. Because the other thing that happened, of course, over this same time period is that we no longer had an all-white workforce. We no longer had an all-male workforce. The workforce became more diversified to reflect the community that we actually serve. And so that was a gain, definitely a gain, because it did do that. It made the workforce. I mean, there are always going to be people who, you know, I'm just coming to work from 9 to 5 and I really don't want to be worried about anything else. But a lot of our people, they did want to know, you know, what kind of people worked in their jobs before them? What were the jobs like before them? And how is this contributing to the fact that Savannah is a very highly regarded community, not just for its guests and its tourists, but also for its residents? People love Savannah, you know. I'll tell you something, this sort of capsules it, and it's not a very complimentary thing, but some of my father and mother's families were not real happy when they found out that they were going to move from the Augusta area to the Savannah area. And what they said was, that city smells awful. And it did in the mid-50s, because there were no environmental controls on the paper mills, and that smell permeated the entire city, and it's not a very pleasant smell. Well, then along came Ralph Nader while I was in college and did one of his studies on all the polluters on the river, and things began to change. You know, they had to start putting equipment on these plants to, you know, tap down the pollution, and that tapped down the smell. And the other thing they said was, and this is very derogatory, and I certainly do not like it, you know, so I'm a little reluctant to repeat it. But what they said about Savannah was, they said Savannah is a town that is owned by the Jews, run by the Catholics, and enjoyed by the blacks. He said nobody else there means anything to anybody in that community. Well, I found that to be very untrue. But at that point in time, that was the stigma that was attached to Savannah, and it was thought of as a stigma. Well, all of those parts of the community have made unbelievable contributions to the community even before they were recognized, you know, and now some of the scholarship is being done because they can get to the records, including the city records, to, you know, to do that, to tell those stories, and to make us I think, more bonded as a community than we might have been otherwise. You know, that everybody really did have a place at the table, and things were going on that weren't documented. Like when Otis Johnson was our mayor, there was, you know, all of a sudden it became aware in the community that the city had hired slaves and had owned slaves during that period, and you know they wanted that story told, and we were able to tell that story. And you know, the thing that Otis Johnson said when there was so much controversy about how awful the city had been for doing this was, look, in Africa, before the slaves ever got to America, African tribes sold slaves to other African tribes. He said, so who do we blame for all of this? And is there any point to all this blaming? No, there isn't. But there is a point to telling the stories so that we all understand better, you know. And maybe we all become a little more humble, you know, about things, and a little more willing to listen and try to build better stories, you know, for the future. So that's one of the things that I think is really important. And I think, you know, with all the historical entities we have, and for instance, now the city has the W.W. Law collection, which Mr. Law was a leader in the civil rights movement, not only in this community, but in Georgia, and maybe at the national level, even so some. And he saved everything he could get his hands on that had anything to do with African American contributions to music, journalism, literature, you name it, painting, you know, art. He saved it all. And, you know, now Luciana has been able to get enough of a staff that's all been wonderfully curated and made available online. And, you know, it makes Savannah not just a local research destination, but also a national one, which we remind them brings people in who rent hotel rooms and Airbnbs, and they buy meals at the restaurants, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
what important work you have done. I love hearing about this.
When we did the Alliance for Response Forum here in December of 2008, that's right, yeah, 2008. That was a program that was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities to the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. And what they were trying to do was encourage communities who had significant cultural heritage resources to begin to make better emergency plans for those things, and to network better, to know where the conservators were, who could be brought in if you had major problems following some kind of a disaster, and to know their first responders, and to know their emergency management leadership, and to know their local government management to the extent possible. So Lynette Stout, who was then the archivist for the Georgia Historical Society, and I together said we would try to do one of those in Savannah. And we worked for months putting together a list of people to be invited. You know, the chiefs of police, there are 7 or 8 municipalities in Chatham County. You know, there's Pooler, Port Wentworth, Garden City, Bloomingdale, you know, you name it. They all have their own city councils and their own police departments and their own fire departments and their own everybody, you know. And so we tried to invite representatives from all those organizations, all the big organizations on the arts, cultural, heritage, historical, and arts scene, like the Telfair. The Telfair actually hosted the event in their new Jepson Center for the Arts, so it was a major thing. And that was really important to do because, as our SEMA director always says, all disasters ultimately, from beginning to end, are local. You need, and in the middle of a disaster is no time to meet the people that you're going to have to be dealing with for the first time. You need to come together and meet them when the skies are all blue.
What led you to focus on disaster preparedness? I mean, this has clearly been a long time focus of yours.
Yeah.
What led you to do that?
When our state archivist went to Mississippi after Katrina, with two people that he had two positions in what's called the Preservation Services Department, and the three of them went as part of a team to help particularly government entities whose facilities had been damaged and their records had been damaged. And he came back a disciple of emergency preparedness because I can't remember all the things he told us, but they were working in Mississippi, which was not New Orleans, this was Mississippi.
Right.
3/4 of their state had lost power and had suffered flooding damage and other kinds of water damage from poor roofs and so forth. He saw, I don't know whether they were first responders or volunteers or temporary labor that had been hired to help, but he saw them cutting the huge tabletop size records volumes in half with chainsaws to be able to fit them into the cartons that they had to evacuate things that had to be handled by a commercial restoration company that handles those things. And that was not the only thing that he saw, but that was the thing that he saw that just flabbergasted him to death, that anybody would not have at least the minimal level of respect for the courthouse records to know that you shouldn't cut them in half.
Yeah.
Just because they were too big, you should get a bigger container and wait to evacuate them until you had the larger container that they would fit in. But, so he sort of became a disciple at that point and really was offering courses at the state archives in basic emergency preparedness and basic emergency response. What are the things you can do? Like, most flooding that occurs in most institutions is 6 inches or less. So make sure that the bottom shelf of all your shelving units is at least 6 inches off the floor. Shelve your records in orders of priority. So the lower levels have things that are not the most prized possessions. If they get flooded, then you can take the time to get them restored, and you're not cutting down on what your most requested items are or whatever. Don't store them on the top shelves, because if your roof comes off, and make sure you have a metal shelf on the top of your shelving units. Don't have boxes exposed, to your ceiling, because it could come off or it could leak in a bad incident. All those really basic kinds of things for preparedness. Make sure you have a photographic inventory. Open your map drawers and photograph how many, what's in there, so that you have genuine inventories that can work for your insurance claims if you already have an insurance provider, or they work for the documentation that FEMA requires for any kind of reimbursement of funds that may be available. Just all sorts of basic knowledge of that kind of stuff. And so you take those, and then you come back and try to fit whatever you can find time to fit in, which is very difficult for our cultural heritage institutions, because so many of them are small staff.
Tiny.
Yeah, their bench strength is just not there. They may have 3 employees, they may only have 1 or 2. They may have 5, but they serve school systems not only here in Chatham County but from all over the state, who bring their busloads of kids in to see historic sites and hear the stories about the American Revolution and the Civil War and all of that. So they can't give over a whole staff member to planning for emergencies. It's just not going to happen. You just have to fit it in wherever you can. And so after I retired and I was serving on the state board, I read the statutory charge to this entity, and one of the clauses is something like this: we should identify endangered records across the state and recommend actions to protect them. What is emergency preparedness? That's what it is. So, and it was a way for me to kind of keep my foot in the door for a little while, because it was a shock to me to think that I was retiring at 60. My daughter was through school, she was married, she had started her career. I had grandchildren, but they all lived somewhere else, and so I thought, I think I can still make some kind of a contribution, and I'm not willing to give up all these wonderful relationships that I've had with people just yet. The terms are 3 years, and I'm now serving my 5th 3-year term.
Uh-huh.
And I've begun to think, because of the projects that I have personally, that my family all expects me to get done, because they've all been giving me all their stuff for, decades now. That I really need to make some time to devote to that. So, I'm really, the last reappointment that I accepted and the one that's coming up, I'm really debating with myself whether I want to whether to continue or not.
Yeah.
Because you just get to that point where you realize you do not have unlimited time, and you do not have unlimited time with all your physical abilities or your intellectual capabilities, that you better not put it off too long, or you may not get the opportunity to finish what you should finish, in that regard. So
it sounds like what you want to finish.
yeah, what I'd like to finish and make sure that I leave some of it intact, because I know lots of stories about, I know the story about my father and mother dating, going to the drive-in movies, and she had 2 younger sisters who wanted to go along, and my father could not bring himself to refusing them. So they dated in the front seat, and they had the 2 younger siblings giggling the whole time in the back seat. So lots of stories like that.
You want people to know about
Yeah, and I want the family to know about
know
those, and I want the family to have the letters. I have a box of letters the size of a college dorm refrigerator, slightly larger, that's full of letters that all of my grandmother's daughters wrote to her, and some of her grandchildren as well, once they were adults and not living close to her, the ones that were far away. They would write letters. My mother wrote her mother a letter every single Sunday afternoon. So I know that in that box of letters are lots of letters that my mother wrote, where she expressed things that I never heard her express. So, I need to get in there and I need to get in there and curate those letters. They're just screaming out to me. That sort of thing.
So actually that gives me a nice chance to turn to both things that you've already been talking about throughout this interview, but I just want to give you a chance to say more things if you want, both about your personal life and life after retirement.
Okay.
I don't know if, you've mentioned your husband and your daughter, and you've mentioned that you have grandchildren. I don't know if there are things that you want to say about, in particular, or anything more about any of them. I'm also interested to hear how you balanced professional work and personal life. That's another area I'm interested in.
That's a big challenge. It's very difficult. Well, let's start with a little bit of my personal life. As I told you, my husband is the middle son with 3 brothers. I mean, he's of 3 sons. He's the middle one. And he grew up in a household with a working mother, who was, had a fairly responsible position. And his father was a Marine in World War II and raised his sons like a Marine might be expected to raise his sons. They were very well behaved. They knew not to cross the line on certain things, so they grew up to be really responsible, sensitive men. His older brother had a career with the what was the name of the Colonial Oil Company here when it was privately owned. His younger brother has wanted to fly from the time he was 5 or 6 years old. So after college, he joined the Navy. He flew with the Blue Angels for about 5 years. And he went on to become a 2-star admiral, and he's now retired also, but that was the way that went. We have, the 6 of us as couples, we have close relationships. They're nice. My husband got a degree in mechanical engineering, and he worked for, most of his career, he started off in a private company that installed wide area computer networks, and he had to learn a lot of computer stuff on his own. But then they were bought by AT&T, and so he was an AT&T computer person for a number of years. Then they divested, and he was part of the units that they divested off from the main T&T. And I think when he retired, he was actually an employee of the name of that firm? I can't remember. Something that started with an A, but I really can't remember. And then his father had been an employee of a local warehousing and development company. And so, the owner of that company had 3 sons and a daughter. His sons were not quite the same age as my husband and his brothers, but they sort of grew up knowing each other and, doing things together. So when my husband retired from his main career with the AT&T and all the computer stuff, then he went to work for one of the sons in that family who was then running the company, and he did that for about 15 years after his first retirement. And that was wonderful for us in the regard that they were friends. And so when our daughter and her husband moved to Italy for 3 years, when our granddaughters were 18 months and 2.5 years old, and we were ready to lynch them, we were able to take off time twice a year to go to spend 2 or 3 weeks in Italy with them while our grandchildren were young. So that was wonderful. Our daughter went to the University of Georgia, where she was one of the Ramsey Fellows on their campus. And so they traveled a lot during her college career. She went to Tanzania, she went to Iceland, she went to China, she went to the Galapagos. Every time there was spring break or holiday break, they took those kids somewhere because they were good ambassadors for the college, and because they wanted them to be able to work in international forums if their future careers required that. So my daughter, she had planned to work in scientific journalism, and her first career was with a new publication called The New Scientist, and they were writing articles and publishing summaries that could be read by lay people as well as scientists about breakthroughs in various trials that were being done and all that sort of thing. And she loved that very much, but she did not like the co-workers that she had. There were some issues there. So she went to talk to her uncle, who was then still in the Navy, and he said, well, why don't you try the Navy's Management Development Program, where they rotate them for 3 months for a year or two among all sorts of commands for the Navy, and see if there's something that interests you there. So she went back to school at the University of Pennsylvania and did not get an MBA, but she got some sort of business management something or other, certificate or associate degree or something. And she said, I like finance, So now she is the accounting director for the U.S. Navy's Fleet Forces Command, which is their Atlantic-based command of all the aircraft carriers and destroyers and all of the fleet who actually are combat-ready vessels. And the latest thing she's done is she trained a team of domestic and international Navy personnel for 2 years to convert the Navy to ERP, Enterprise Resource Planning, which is the major strategic, financial, and human resource and supply resource management system, an integrated system. So she did training for people all over the world, and that sort of thing. And her husband has a master's degree in music. He's a wonderful pianist and organist. He taught music at Old Dominion University for a while, and also taught languages at the private school where their children started school in Norfolk, Latin, Spanish, French, and German.
Wow.
And then he decided that, I think COVID did him in, because in their environment, where you would think they would get really good parental support to make sure that the high school students were staying with the program and really learning, the environment just didn't make it happen. They were teaching remotely, and he hated remote online teaching very much. It didn't give him the opportunity to interact with students and to really have a good handle on what was happening and whether or not they were learning what he wanted them to learn. He's a movie buff too, so he and a colleague in Canada wrote a book on the movies of the woman whose father was also a movie director. Sophia, the name won't come to me right now. Anyway, they did that. And now he works as a project manager for a marine construction and building concern, fair lead in Norfolk. And he's
Amazing.
very happy being in the commercial sector, in the industrial sector right now. So
Amazing.
who knows? I mean, people of that generation, they seem to, they decide they want to do something different and they just get themselves prepared and they go do it. They're much more ready to make changes that I think would be dramatic changes in their career fields that I feel like even our generation,
Yes.
or your generation and my generation
Yes.
were.
Yes.
We tended to find a niche sooner and just, try to develop in that niche.
Yes.
But they like to explore lots of diversity. My husband, I've never found anything that he can't fix. And here's a story I might not should share, but I'm going to share it anyway. When his brother was training as a pilot, to join, as a Navy fighter pilot, one Labor Day weekend, he checked out a trainer plane and flew to Savannah to see his family so his mom could see him fly. And when it was time to go back, he couldn't get his plane started. And there was no staff working on Labor Day at the airfield here, the military airfield. And there was no staff working at the military airfield where the trainer planes were. So he calls my husband and says, I need you to come out here and help me get this plane started. I gotta take it home. So my husband takes what he calls an ohm meter and his tool bag that I can hardly pick up, it's so heavy, and he goes out to the airfield, and he doesn't know anything about aircraft mechanics, but he put the ohm meter on whatever the ohm meter reads, and then he opens whatever he opens, and they were able to get the thing started. And
Wow.
I don't know what happened there. I do not know what happened. I'm a fairly strong believer in divine intervention, and I think there was a fair amount of divine intervention there. I really do. I also think there was a fair amount of divine intervention at play when I retired at 60, much earlier than I had planned to, and that was one of my sisters, in the older two twins, died that summer.
Sorry.
And I was able to spend time with her in the hospital that would never have been possible had I still been working. So I think the Lord took care of that. And the next year, of all things, it was the woman who was my matron of honor for my wedding. Had an undiagnosed cancer, and then when it finally manifested itself well enough that it could be picked up in the medical test, she lived only 2 weeks after that.
Oh.
And I was there with her all of that 2 weeks. So both of those things would have been impossible had I still been working. They just would have. So I felt like that was a gift, that I received to have that time. Even though I didn't like this predicament I was in when I had to make the decision that yes, I would retire rather than fire somebody that our institution had been grooming for 5 or more years to be able to take on this role. And by the way, Luciana has done splendidly in this role. And I told her a year or so ago, I said, you finally have all the staff in place that I said in 1985 we needed in our strategic plan. I said, you have achieved that. And it's because all the functions have proved their worth over time to
That's wonderful.
to the institution. So that's a real rewarding feeling, even though I didn't get to see it realized. The wheels of government might turn slowly, but they do turn. And if they turn with the bond rating still very, very high, then I'm not going to complain about it. I'm going to say, yes, that was done the way it should have been done.
So just want to go back to one other thing about your personal life, and you said this was a big topic, and I know this from my own
experience.
Situation.
Yeah.
How did you balance professional work with your personal life?
Well, my husband was a really good partner in helping achieve that. And I'll give you a couple of examples. We decided early on in our marriage, or early on in our parenting time, that we were not going to go out on Friday night every week and leave our child with a babysitter. That we were going to try to do things together as a family that might have to be done in the daytime, which meant other things would need to be done on Friday night. And the habit that I had gotten into early on, I mean, when my child was still in a baby seat, I read to her every night, every single night. We shared reading time. And so, you know, by the time she got to first grade, she could practically read by herself, whatever you wanted to put in front of her. I mean, it was just one of those things. But anyway, so we made that decision, and so when we did things on Friday afternoons, we did them together as a family, and we missed out on a lot of the couples things that we could have been a part of, but we felt like overall it was the right decision for us. And then, you know, everybody needs their creative outlet. You know, they need some time to themselves. My husband liked to go out and shrimp with a friend of his. So, you know, when they wanted to go shrimp, I didn't make a big deal about it. If I thought there was something that I had wanted him to help me do, or wanted him to do at home or whatever, I let it go for a while, you know, just so he could have his time to do something that really interested him. And he has a particular hobby that he developed with his uncle, who lived to be 97. His uncle, when we were dating and he was getting ready to ask me to marry him, his uncle, as a young man, had always owned convertibles because he said that a convertible was an automatic chick magnet. And so somebody in there that he knew had a convertible for sale, a 1965 T-Bird convertible with a rounded back seat. I mean, really sleek 60s look to it. Very beautiful car. And he wanted Larry to buy it because they only wanted $200 for it. And my husband said, well, right now I just can't spare the money because I have to buy an engagement ring. And so he didn't buy it. And my uncle was so frustrated with him for not buying the convertible that he bought it himself. And he kept it. He kept it all for the rest of his life. And he and his wife, who also lived to be 97, they drove it around town to the Walmart and to the Carrie Hilliard's family restaurant and to the church and wherever they wanted to drive it. And my husband worked on it for him and with him. You know, this was their thing together. They would, you know. And so, because my husband loved it, and he loved his uncle, and loved spending time with him, and that couple, his side of the family was his father and that brother and one sister. And so, my husband became the son that uncle never had. They just had one daughter. And so, you know, he loved his uncle, and they, you know, they had a really close relationship all of his life. So his time was, you know, working on the T-Bird. And then when that uncle passed, the T-Bird became my husband's property. So it's a very beloved thing that we like to enjoy every now and then. And then for me, I liked music. In fact, I wanted to major. You know, life has a way of working things out that you never expect. I wanted to major in music when I went to college because I wanted to teach, you know, I wanted to direct choirs and choruses and so forth. My father, being the practical man that he was, he said at that time, you cannot earn a living in music. It's just not a stable form of employment. You need to become a CPA. He was adamant that I was going to become a CPA. He wanted a CPA in the family. And that was because in the Postal Service, you know, he quit school at the 8th grade, so he never had any really good training in bookkeeping. And the Postal Service would send somebody to audit his operation about every 2 or 3 years. And they always wrote him up for his weird accounting. They could never find any evidence that any money was ever lost or wasn't spent as it should have been spent, because my dad was tight and he knew where every penny went and he kept records about where every penny went. But his counting looked weird. And so he decided that his revenge would be that his oldest child would become a CPA. You know, I didn't want to be a CPA. The idea of working with figures all the time. I mean, I loved math. I did great in math all the way through school. But it wasn't what I wanted to do for my life's work. And so he said, well, go to work and make your tuition, you know. So that's basically what I did. I got a few scholarships along the way. And, you know, I came out a librarian, and he was just mortified. He didn't think librarians could make a living either. But we remained on good terms. I loved him dearly, you know, despite the fact. And lo and behold, what does my daughter do? She manages finances where they leave off the last 3 or the last 6 of the digits in all their record keeping, you know. And he's not allowed to see it. I wish he were. But, you know, the circle comes around, and divine providence takes care of a great deal of things, you know, that, you know, they do resolve themselves over the generations, you know. So that's, you know, so my husband, to indulge my music, he gave me my Wednesday nights to do church choir music. And I directed a ladies' ensemble of 15 women for about 25 years. The constituency changed, you know, members came and went, but I had an ensemble that I directed for about 25 years. And I sang in church choirs and still sing in church choirs, and, you know, have done some really wonderful things. We grew up in the church where we grew up. You know, of course, that was the baby boomer generation. And our first director was this huge barrel-chested man with this gorgeous Russian male sounding kind of voice. We just loved him. He was just this huge teddy bear. He started our graded choir program when I was in 5th grade. And then after that, I went all the way through our high school and college choir. By then we had a different director, but he taught all of us as children. We had graded choirs for each grade of elementary school that had between 35 and 50 kids in them.
That's impressive.
We did competitions where at that time the state denominational convention would, you know, churches that wanted to participate could come to Atlanta once a year, and they would be judged and graded, and there would be competition. You know, one would be named the best, and they gave us specific music that we had to learn to perform, and then we could choose some that we would perform, and we had black skirts and white blouses, red ribbons for Christmas and yellow ribbons for Easter, and, you know, it was a big thing. I mean, it was just, you know, everybody went to choir rehearsal. And I directed children's choirs while my daughter was still the age to do that. And she went to the preschool. A friend of ours, a longtime family friend of ours, was the director of the preschool that Candler Hospital opened about the time my child was born, maybe a few years after that. But when she got, I guess when she became 3, that was when I put her in their school. And they had some teachers at their school who were professional musicians with the Savannah Symphony at that time, but they couldn't make enough money to live off of, so they wanted to teach. So they came to that school, among others, and said, you know, would you like us to have a Suzuki string program on your campus where we can start the children as young as 2 or 3 years old if they want to participate? And so a group of us in the school said, yeah, that sounds wonderful. We'll support the musicians, and we'll, you know, our children will have this learning experience. And so for 16 years, for 14 years, for 12 years, we paid for violin instruction for our daughter, and she went all the way through the Suzuki program, and then she played in the university orchestra at University of Georgia, when she was there. But she did not want to pursue it professionally, and she was not good enough to pursue it professionally. We have 3 professional musicians that came out of that program that started at the hospital. 2 of them are violinists, and one of them is a double bass, upright bass player, and he is a worldwide renowned player now. He plays on an instrument that was built in 1875 that he travels with. He only has the right to play it as long as he is the first chair bassist for the Philadelphia Orchestra, but it travels with him and gets its own seat in the airplane. It does not go in the cargo component, you know. So, and there was just a wonderful group of parents here at that time who thought this was a great idea, and we all stuck with it. Perseverance is really important, because when they got up into in their elementary and middle school years, They rehearsed every Saturday morning from 9 until 12. And
That's
the parent,
intense.
that's intense. When they got into the high school level and the civic orchestra level, they rehearsed on Sunday afternoons from 1 to 3 or something like that. And we worshiped every Sunday morning. So, we get through church at 12 o'clock. We have 1 hour for lunch. I prepared meals on Saturday for lunch on Sunday for years.
Yeah.
And then, that was our Sunday. And, I don't know how we did it. There are blocks of things that happened in there that I don't have much recall of, and I think it's because, they were just going in, getting processed, something was done, and out they went. That was the cycle. And I only had one child. I had preeclampsia when she was born, and I nearly died from what I was later told. And my doctor never said, I don't want you to have another child. But I figured out on my own that if I tried it, I might leave this child an orphan, especially knowing what happened to my mother with her pregnancies. And we just decided, even though I wanted my husband to have a son very badly. But, his other two brothers both had two boys. So my daughter was the only granddaughter that his mother ever had. It was beloved beyond reason. She didn't indulge her beyond reason, but she did love her beyond reason because she was the only, when her youngest son was born, she had the nursery painted pink and had pink roses for throw pillows and all of that kind of stuff because she was sure on the third try she was going to get a girl.
Oops.
But she did.
No. So I have two more kind of big topics that I want to ask you about.
Okay.
And one of them is about Savannah. And I realize the question I'm about to ask, we could talk about this for hours.
I'll give you a good story.
But how you've seen Savannah change over your lifetime. You've been here since you were 5 years old, right? So 1956, right? What would you say about how you've seen Savannah change over your lifetime?
I had a library director at the public library when I was still doing bookmobiles, I worked there for a while as a reference librarian too, a few years. And he was from North Carolina. So he wasn't a local, he was from North Carolina. And he said to me one time, he asked me where I was from, and I said, well, I grew up in Savannah and I went to school here, but my family was from Augusta. And he said, well, what I've learned about Savannah is that you are not from Savannah unless your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, your great-great-great-great-grandmother, and as far back as you can prove that there was any mother involved, was conceived under a magnolia leaf in Johnson Square.
Oh my.
So he was referencing, there was an elite a group of people here who had been here forever, been here forever, and this was their city, and they were going to see to it that it was run the way it should be run in all aspects. I don't think I really experienced that much. Maybe it was because my family was perfectly happy in the middle class circles that we ran around in, were part of. We built things together, did projects together. Like my mother, who played basketball in high school, used to dress up in granny clothes with a rural farm bonnet on and play basketball in the faculty and parent-teacher organization annual fundraising event for the school. Those are the sorts of things they participated in. My mother used to carry the little cans for the March of Dimes around in our neighborhood every year for people to put their coins in. Took at least one child with her on every excursion, and any other fundraising thing that they wanted neighborhood mothers to help with, she always helped with. So, I didn't have to be up against that very much, and I was going to public school, and we had very good public schools then, I think. We had a lot of parent involvement because their mothers were mostly homemakers, and they participated. They did anything that was needed at the school. My mother worked in the school kitchen serving meals. She worked in the library typing library card catalog cards, and all sorts of things like that. So I didn't necessarily agree with that, but in the time I have lived in Savannah, I've seen the city become much more diverse in terms of who's part of the population here. For instance, this morning at the meeting I was attending, there was a woman there from a group called the Georgia Grow Initiative. They provide interpreter services in emergency situations where you've got to get information to people who don't understand English. So she wanted to know if we knew what the 3 most prevalent languages were in Savannah. English, of course, is first. Spanish is second. The third is any of several Afghani dialects. Pashto, Dari, Fari, all of those. And I was a little amazed at that. I would have thought maybe something where a lot of people on boats come from that speak that language. Anyway, so it's become much more diverse in terms of who's here. Much more diverse city, I think, in terms of the recruitment for positions and who's working in jobs and so forth. It's also just grown tremendously, and to some extent, I'm not real happy with some of the growth that I see now. There are way too many big box warehouses going up. They're just eating up farm property and forest land and everything. They're eating up everything. From the little bit of knowledge that I gained, doing some law enforcement research, I'm also alarmed at so many developments of high density housing. Lots of apartment complexes, a lot of townhouse developments. So they haven't been able to preserve some of what I think are the more attractive vestiges of some of the older subdivisions, and by older I mean some that were built in the 50s even, and in the 60s, where they have nice yards, they have nice trees, tree cover. But nonetheless, that development is happening, and the community is just mushrooming to the north, south, and west. It can't mushroom to the east because there's an ocean there.
Yes.
But everywhere else, that's happening. I don't think we've resolved all the issues between public education and private education. Even before the civil rights movement desegregated the school systems, every denomination in town had their own school. The Catholics, the Lutherans, the Baptists, the Methodists, everybody, the Presbyterians, they all had, maybe it only went to the 8th grade, they didn't have a high school, but they had their own schooling. And there was a lot of devotion to those schools because the families, there was generational associations with those schools. So we still kind of have, we have public schools, and we have what are mostly parochial private schools. Country Day, I guess, is one of the few that's not associated with a religious denomination, or Christianity or Catholicism or something. So that, I think, still needs some work in our community. What other ways have I seen the community change? Well, tourism has become much more of the local economy than it was when we started. I mean, when we first lived here. Yes, people visited here, but they went to the beach, because the preservation movement had not really matured to the level that we now have all the cultural heritage institutions who sponsor their own festivals. They make their venues available for rent for weddings and other kinds of family and corporate gatherings. That element has just really mushroomed. And one of the main trolley companies here now is actually not just Savannah Trolleys, but they own trolleys in St. Augustine, Washington, D.C., all the way up the coast to New England. They have operations, trolley. So their emergency director, for instance, is their national safety and emergency director, not just their Savannah director. So, that kind of thing is happening. I don't know. I think our community is, in some places, fairly well bonded over all of its diverse, components. I think the St. Patrick's Day Festival is definitely a widely community bonded event. Um, Now we're getting these, you know, pro teams for sports, hockey in Savannah. You know, I said, these people are crazy. They're going to lose so much money. No, they're not losing money. All these people that have come to Savannah from all these places where they skated and did hockey, played hockey and, you know, skied on snow instead of water, they all love it.
Yeah.
And so do some of the natives too. I mean, it's, you know, it's much more of an acceptance. So that's changed. We did not have, and now we're going to have a women's basketball team. Yeah, you know, who would have thought? Women's pro basketball teams didn't even exist. You know, and of all things, the Savannah Bananas, who are making a fortune, taking a hybrid of what baseball is now and what it used to be, and they're turning it into, you know, draws huge crowds everywhere. I think they're even going to do international gigs this year, or already have. You know, that just didn't happen in Savannah. Savannah was much more of a sleepy southern town. But one thing I did appreciate when I went to Emory graduate school, we had a New England and New York contingent that were part of that campus for graduate programs. And several of them said to me, but you don't talk like a Southerner. And I said, you mean I don't say right and night and, you know, all of that? Yeah, that's it. You don't talk like that. And I said, well, you know, I grew up in a community where that we weren't allowed to talk that way, I guess. I don't know why I don't, but I don't have quite the Southern accent that they were expecting from all of us who were from the Deep South.
That's really interesting.
And Savannah's always been a little bit more cosmopolitan, a little bit more liberal than I think a lot of Southern Georgia.
What made it that way, would you say, or what's made it that way?
The fact that it was a port city, and so people came here from lots of different places from the very beginning. You know, what was the second group of people that came to Savannah included Jewish people. You know, and there was a doctor in the group, so they were allowed to stay. And a group came from Germany, you know, who went up to Effingham County to Ebenezer, escaping religious persecution, but they brought a whole different culture with them. You know, and the member of my high school class who became the rocket scientist and helped develop the Star Wars initiative, his family were German, and they wound up living in Savannah when he was growing up. But you know, they were descendant from that initial group of Germans that came in the 1700s. You know, so it's just it's a port city. If you ever want to read a really interesting book about what Savannah was like when it was developing, read Paul Presley's book called, I think the title is On the Rim of the Caribbean. And so he talks about how Savannah was tied into all these Caribbean ports. And so elements of that culture came to Savannah, and it was a rough and brawdy town, port town. Really, very interesting book to read.
And what would you say about how the city's relationship to its history has changed or not changed? I mean, do you think people value local history differently now here than they did, I don't know, at various points when you were working for the city?
I think it's been commercialized a lot more, or it is commercialized a great deal more now than it was when I was growing up here in the early years when I worked here. Then there was a very definite emphasis on historical accuracy and not doing things that would compromise in any way what had managed to be saved through the decades of the Civil War and the Depression and so forth. Like, for instance, there was a public outcry, you know, when they tore down the old city market and built a parking garage on it in the 50s. It was, you know, that was what gave a lot of impetus to the historic preservation movement, that we don't want people tearing down all this stuff. Luciana, one of her earliest books that she did for Acadia in that Images of America series, is called Lost Savannah, where she went and found photographs and information about the historic homes and businesses that were torn down, like all the original skyscraper hotels in Savannah that were torn down. So, you know, there was this period right after the, in the 50s and 60s and 70s probably, when there was a lot of local fervor to make sure we provide the adequate stewardship to what has managed to survive to this point, because a lot was lost before this, even though they did save Savannah from Sherman's fires at the end and toward the end of the Civil War. There was still a lot that was lost through just general progress, what was called progress. But now I think what I see is sort of a commercialization and almost to some point an exploitation of this by not local entities but commercial entities that are coming in to take advantage of the fact that there is something here that there isn't in many other places in the country. And I'm not sure whether that's beneficial or not beneficial. I think the jury's still out on that. We have a lot more congestion, particularly downtown. But then, we also have a much more diverse cosmopolitan atmosphere, and that may be good for our children to grow up in. At one point, we had an art exhibit sometime, I think before I retired, and they asked people to do renditions of their impressions of Savannah. And I remember one of them was a student who had come from an Asian country to go to school at SCAD, and she talked about what she experienced coming over the Talmadge Bridge over the Savannah River, what the city looked like, and how she loved it. All these treetops everywhere, and all this blue water and blue sky, and that sort of thing. That's part of what people love about Savannah too. So all those impressions, and I think they've relaxed some of the historic district guidelines that used to be ironclad. They would never allow a developer to vary from them. It didn't matter who they were. They could be the Hiltons or the Marriotts or the whoever of this world, and no, you may not build it any taller. Now they're allowing some taller structures. They're allowing them closer together in some of the historic areas. And there may be about as many myths circulating about Savannah's history as there are truthful stories. And that may or may not be a good thing either. Because some of the stories they tell about public hangings and, ghosts and all sorts of things like that are not necessarily even close to the truth, much less the truth. And they've, I know they've worked with that some to we tried at one time to help them develop a test for tour guides that they would have to pass in order to get a license. And I'm not sure where that is right now, but I don't think they use it anymore. So things like that have changed.
So, one sort of more set of questions, and one of them is, what accomplishments are you most proud of?
The Youth Futures Authority research is definitely up there. The Annie B. Casey Foundation grant research is there. And I'm proud of the role we played in helping, and it was, we were just one piece of the puzzle, but the role that we played in helping all the employees of the city at whatever level, professional down to, the most basic laborer or clerical worker, feel proud of the part of the team that they were a part of, and proud of their accomplishments. I mean, I think people's lives are much better if they feel like what they're doing matters. Who wants to work at a job where they feel like nobody cares whether they do a good job or a poor job, or whether they ever contribute any positive idea they thought they had? I don't know how that's going right now in government, because I've been out of the city government for 15 years. But while I worked in it, I was really proud of that. That was something that was good to feel like you were bonding people closer together and making them more of a working team and achieving better results because of it. That was important. And I'm glad we started the capital improvement plan, because now you go into the Archives and History office in the Savannah in the city hall, and it's gorgeous. You know, and all that restored furniture is, I'm glad I did those clandestine furniture grabs and closet hides, and I'm glad I did the dives in the trash cans, you know, because things got saved that now are part of the meaningful story. You know, they can be found and they can be used. We've had one book written, you know, that used the municipal archives as a major source, and a couple of others that have credited the municipal archives in their acknowledgments. And those things mean a lot to me, because that says, yes, public records are important too, you know, for many reasons, not just because they help safeguard our rights, our constitutional rights and our state statutory rights and so forth, but because they also help tell the important stories about what we've been and what we are and what we might hope to become, you know.
I know you also said to me when we weren't recording that, and you just referred to this briefly, but that you saved a lot of furniture.
Yes. Yeah, all
At
that.
City Hall, and you said City Hall was built in 1906.
Right,
is that
1906. And every piece of furniture in it was designed. There are design plans for the furniture.
Yeah.
It was built specifically for that building. So we have metal roll-top desk. We have a gorgeous, the cabinet, the bookcase that was built to go in the mayor's office originally. It has 3 sections of double doors, beveled glass. It's just beautiful, beautiful glass. We were able to save that, and a number of wood, you know, wood slab tabletops that, you know, they got a little pocketed over time, but they were able to be restored. And the original chairs there, the barrel back office style chairs. I mean, all of those things. I walked into that building and I thought, you know, I wasn't much of a preservationist. I mean, I didn't have any preservationist experience, but something inside me said, this is a historic city, and these are historic objects that belong to everybody in this city. They should not be carted off to the dump because somebody got a new cheap office desk in their office that just happened to be newer and bigger than the one they had that was originally designed for the office. You know, so, I don't know. I think something in my blood is just oriented toward the stories that we inherit, you know, and the things that we inherit. And I was very proud of that too. That and the start of the Capital Improvement Fund. We had visions of building a records management facility somewhere out on this site where this building is, this administrative building. And I actually made a trip to one of the manufacturer's sites that was in Chicago or somewhere up there to look at mobile shelving, because we wanted to put mobile shelving in it because that's so much more space efficient, that went up 20 feet in the air. And I thought, oh my goodness, how do you get up there to service records, you know, pull boxes of records out? And, you know, they use a lift in this. But I also talked to them about, okay, what happens to the rail system under this shelving with all this weight on it, and we have a disaster inundation of salt water. I says, what's going to happen to that? Is it going to work, or is it all of a sudden you can't move it, you know? And everything's got to be reloaded, and the whole thing's got to be rebuilt, the track system under it. And that gave them a pause because they weren't sure that they could guarantee that it would still slide with just the turn of that turnstile on the end. It just makes it glide so easily, particularly with the weight that 20 feet of records boxes would put on it. But that, you know, we had started that kind of investigation because we were hoping that, you know, eventually that fund would get big enough to build that kind of a structure. I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, but I won't say that it won't happen ever. I think it might still, you know. So I'm not gonna give up hope that they do that. We had another courthouse fire in Georgia just a couple of weeks ago in one of the northwestern counties where Rome, Georgia is. Right now I can't remember the name of the county, but it burned the attic of their courthouse, their historic courthouse, and there were things stored there. And my experience when I was more active in the Georgia Records Association, and I occasionally got asked to go and look at facilities in other places where they were considering storing records,
Yeah.
is that they're almost non-existent all over the Georgia communities, cities, counties, whatever. They just don't have adequate facilities. And that means that they get stored in temporary commercial rental storage space, like when you're renovating your kitchen and you store stuff in it for 3 months, their stuff is there for years. And they get stored in, we brought into City Hall, to the archives, fire department records that had been stored in a shipping container behind one of the fire stations, just piled in there on the floor, just a big pile of record books on all the firefighters, all the registers that they kept at all the fire stations, of all the shift they'd, their names, the shifts they had filled, and all sorts of information, about those. Oh, I'll tell you something else I was really proud of. That brought it to mind. At one point, the city was sued for disparity in its purchasing and procurement practices. And the people who were suing us wanted to see the last 5 years' worth of every contract the city had issued.
Mm-hmm.
And we had them.
Huh. Amazing.
All several hundred of those
Wow.
boxes
Amazing.
we brought back so there people could take a look at them.
Amazing.
And take a look at a few of them. They did. And then they decided they had not found enough evidence of this disparity to want to continue, because the documentation was there and we could produce it, every box of it. We brought it back from the Commercial Record Center. I think it was supposed to stay there. I think their retention period was something like maybe 11 years. I can't remember right now the specific retention period. But we had what they wanted, and we brought it back to City Hall, and we lined it up all around the walls, on the floors of City Hall, for them to pick a box.
Wow.
Pick a box and look at anything you want to see. You're welcome to see it. And so the suit, they couldn't pursue it because they couldn't produce the evidence, because it had all been saved and they could look at it. So, when a government gets sued and they have to pay out $1 million or $2 million or whatever the damage is assessed to be, all that money disappears from the money they need to use for everything positive they're trying to do in the community. And so it's a serious matter. And that was one of the things that I taught when I taught those classes, where I was trying to get people who drive vehicles to keep the logs they should keep about their time in their vehicles and all of that information. I said, you're looking at, you don't keep it and we can't produce it when there's an accident or something, then we get sued and you lose money to replace this vehicle before you're ashamed to be driving around town in it, and it's a constant expense for maintenance. That's how I taught those things about, this is why this is important. Yeah, you have to develop a habit to do it, but it's a habit that could save us millions of dollars, not just hundreds of thousands, but even millions of dollars.
And then be used for
That could be used
meaningful
for things that you want to happen
Yeah.
in where you're doing your job.
Yeah.
That won't happen because there's not money there to fund them. So that was something that meant something to me too, to try to be able to make that argument and hear and see the wheels turn in people's heads and say, oh yeah, I never thought about that. I said, you got to think like lawyers do.
Uh-huh.
And none of us think like lawyers do. They're
Uh-huh.
very creative thinkers.
Uh-huh.
They're very creative thinkers. That's why they make so much money. They're very creative thinkers.
So I have one more question for you, then I'll ask you if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to include. But my last question for you is, how would you like your work to be remembered? Work here at the city in the 15 years since retirement, where you've been doing so much. You've had a whole second career, essentially, right? All the other work you've been doing. But how would you like your work to be remembered?
That's a good question. I don't think everybody's work is remembered in a personal association to somebody. You have to be, I'll give you an example. one of my oldest cousins who had children probably that were about my age when I was born,
Mhm.
you know, or not my age now, but they were, you know, they were up in school, grade school, whatever. She married a man who was part of the first graduating class of the Air Force Academy. He was from Aiken, South Carolina,
Mhm.
right across the river from Augusta.
Mhm.
And his first experiences were in Vietnam, or not, maybe not his very first ones, but he had experience in Vietnam flying those low-level reconnaissance missions just over the jungle tops, looking for the Viet Cong so he could tell the bombers where to drop the bombs. So essentially, what happened to John McCain could have happened to him very easily. But he went on, he stayed in the Air Force, and he just kept advancing and kept advancing and kept advancing. So when the first Persian Gulf War erupted over, you know, the fate of Kuwait,
Mhm.
he was actually the commander of the Military Airlift Command, the MAC, and he became the commander for the joint forces of all the military in getting everything that was needed to fight that war into the theater of war. And I've only become aware of this in recent days, recent times, because he just turned 90 in December, and he's now in Alzheimer's care. But there was a report written by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was a report from the Joint Chiefs of Staffs that was entitled "So Much, So Many, So Far, So Fast." And it's the story of how he got all that material into the theater of war. And it was a very, very short war as a result, because everything that they needed, everybody that they needed, was there all at the same time. That should be remembered personally in association with that person, because that's really a phenomenal feat of modern warfare. What I did is not quite that scope, so I think what I would want to be remembered maybe was that I was part of that story. You know, if they've got a list of all the people who were ever the directors of the Municipal Research Library, I hope my name shows up in there and doesn't get left off accidentally or something. But I think it's more important that the function survive and that it continue to evolve so that it plays an important role in whatever local government becomes as it progresses, and part of whatever our city becomes, because I think having good government is very important to a city being basically healthy. And I'm very proud of the fact that our current mayor is going to be the president of the National League of Cities in a few years, and he wasn't our first African American mayor, but he, you know, he progressed through government and knew a lot about how government worked before he ever got to this point. And I think he's done a super job. He had to deal with COVID, and that was not something, he didn't come into that office wanting to deal with COVID. He came with some other goals in mind, which had to just be put aside almost, because he had to deal with COVID. And he did a great job dealing with it. You know, he let the restaurants put their tables outside on the sidewalk and in the emergency lane of the streets or whatever, the bike lanes, so they wouldn't go under. And, you know, just really meaningful local decisions. So I would not so much, you know, the individual things that I did, because I think they're just part of the fabric, you know, part of the tapestry. But the functions themselves, I hope, continue to be remembered and expected and expanded and adapted as they need to adapt as we go through time. I'm kind of hoping that my family, you know, as that progresses, that will be, you know, those things will be remembered, because I think the family stories are very inspiring, you know. And I'll tell you one that I always like. My mother and her family grew up on a farm on a place that was probably very much like Tobacco Road, that's been written about, you know, by Erskine Caldwell and others. And she would tell me occasionally that the mothers that lived in their area didn't get enough to eat to produce milk enough for the babies that they needed to nurse. So there were both white people and people of color living in that same general area, farming, trying to survive off of what they could yield from their land. When the white mothers could not produce enough milk, if there was a black mother nursing a child who would nurse their child, she did so. when the black mothers couldn't produce enough milk, they needed somebody to nurse a child, there was a white woman who would do it. To me, that is a classic Georgia story. That somehow, even after all the devastation of the Civil War, we have managed to survive and thrive, and we gave the country Martin Luther King, of all things, who used to come down south of Savannah and have, strategy planning meetings at the Dorchester Academy, which was a school for African Americans. So, there's that kind of story that I want to survive, that kind of family story that I want to survive. My mother told me that, when they could not afford to have an animal to pull a plow, the girls pulled the plow because there was nothing but girls in the family to till the land, if their father was sick or whatever, but they did their part, And when I was growing up, my mother could, we had a pear tree in our yard. Every August we picked pears and got a frizzy permanent. We always went back to school with a frizzy hair permanent because she gave us all a permanent. But we picked pears, and she canned pears, she made pear preserves, all of those things. One of my favorite memories of my father is getting up before it was light in the morning. He would go to the farmer's market and buy a bushel or several bushels of peas or butter beans in the summertime, come home, spread the newspaper on the dining room table, pour it all on the dining room table. All 5 of us would shell until all was shelled, and then my mother would, freeze, butter beans and peas, and all winter we ate fresh vegetables, So that's the kind of family story I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren to know, that there are ways to meet challenges. There are ways to meet challenges. You just figure it out and you do something. What I did to buy shelving for the archives to begin with was I would kind of I would squeeze on the money that I spent for printed material, and if I had a couple of $1,000s left toward the end of the year, I would go to the budget department and I'd say, "Can I buy a unit of metal shelving with this?" And they would say, "Okay." That's how it worked for a couple of years, maybe 10 years. That's kind of how it worked. All right, is there anything I haven't told you that I'd like to tell you? Go back and start with the first question again, and let me see if anything, just ask me the question again, let me see if anything quickly comes to mind.
The question that I'd asked about
how you want it to be
how
remembered.
you want it to be remembered.
Not that one, but when we started the interview, we started with the question about my childhood.
Oh, I'd asked you to tell me about your early life growing up in Savannah.
In Savannah, okay, growing up in Savannah. What else have I not mentioned that maybe I should? Talked about choirs, I've talked about walking to the library, I've talked about my teachers in elementary school. We were the first class of my junior high school, which was, that was sort of a distinctive thing. And we wrote the school song with the help of the bassoonist who taught orchestra at our school. He wrote a wonderful tune. It's our unique song. It was written specifically for this, and we specifically wrote the words to it. Our chorus director helped us in that effort, but we wrote that, which was always, I just thought, this is magnificent. We've written a piece of music, ourselves. And we were only 7th graders and 8th graders and 9th graders. So that was a big deal to be part of that school. And I had with a few exceptions, I had very good teachers there. One of them taught me to sing all the being verbs to the tune of Jingle Bells. Be, being, been, am, is, are, was, were, has, have, had. And I've remembered it. I'll never forget it. I'll remember it forever. It's just in your head. Very useful when you're likely to get an automatic F on an essay in college if you can't remember how to handle that situation appropriately. And in high school, very good teachers. My literature teachers I loved the most, of course. I did. I loved my literature teachers. Had very good history teachers as well. Very good. Okay, college. In college, I was kind of just trying to survive because I was taking a lot of literature classes, which required a lot of reading. I mean, at one point, I had 2 classes the same quarter where I was required to read a book every day.
Wow.
And I will admit that during that period, some of them I read cover to cover, and some of them I read every other chapter or the beginning and the end, and I found a cliff notes to read in between because there was just wasn't not enough time. And I was working, at that point I was working about half a day every day. And so, but I, I could stay awake till 1 or 2 o'clock, but I had to have some sleep. And you talk about my Emory experience, and this is what I'll tell you I remember about that too. I had a meal plan, so I went from the dorm to the, I like breakfast. I'm an early morning person. I like to get up and study in the morning. I like to get up and, figure out problems in the morning, that sort of thing. So I always went to breakfast. And at that point, in the morning, that early, you would see the medical students coming from the hospital to the cafeteria to get breakfast before they went to their classes or went home to get a little bit of sleep or whatever. But they had worked all night at the hospital. Those mostly young men at that time looked like the kiss of death.
Sure.
They were just haggard looking, because at that time they were still having the medical students take all the night shifts at the hospital and trying to learn to practice medicine. And I thought, I don't know if I ever want a doctor working on me again, doing anything. I mean, they're supposed to learn to be doctors, and this is what they look like every day. And I saw them every day, for an entire quarter I would see them. And they never looked any better the whole time. And I thought, this is disgraceful.
Right.
And they've changed that now, I understand.
Yes.
They've realized that doctors are human beings too, and they have to have some sleep, But I thought, this is just ridiculous. So that was part of my Emory experience. I thought, this really needs to change, and I don't know any way to make that happen. I didn't, absolutely didn't.
But you were witnessing it.
But I was witnessing it, and I thought, this is wrong. This is just dead wrong. Okay, go to the next question. See if there's anything else I didn't tell you.
We covered so much wonderful territory.
Let me tell you another Don Mendoza story, because I like this one too.
Okay.
Don and I often arrived at the city hall at the same time in the morning, because he was kind of an early morning person too. And so we would ride up from the sub-basement up, to the 4th floor. You have sub-basement, basement, then 4 floors. Don, I could see the wheels turning in Don's head every single morning. He was already deep in thought, trying to figure out how he was going to handle whatever was going to happen that day. I never dared to break that silence, and he never spoke in the elevator. No good morning, no, it's cold today, or, the temperature is getting really hot. None of that, no small talk. And I could see the wheels turning in his head, literally. You could see him thinking. It was amazing to me. I never had anybody that didn't even say good morning when we got in the elevator, but I never dared to break that silence. And after I had worked in the office for, let me see, I went to work for them in what year did you tell me? I went 77?
Late 78.
Late 78,
1978.
okay, and my daughter was born in 1981. So I worked those years, and I didn't have a child. And when my husband and I decided we were ready to have a child and I got pregnant, I debated for a long time how I was going to tell him that I was pregnant, because I thought it was going to mean that he no longer needed my services. That was sort of the climate that we were in at that point of trying to be professional women. And so I finally lit on the perfect solution. I wrote him, and I put it on an inter-office memo form, and in it went in his inbox in the stack with everything else. and I waited then to see how long before he came in the office and told me, well, you can work until you're, 7 or 8 months pregnant, and then you'll need to terminate your employment. He came into the office, and this was a man who I did not see express emotion, or he was focused on work all the time. He came into the office, he put his arm around my shoulder, he kissed me on the cheek and said, congratulations. I was so thankful. Because I didn't want to give up my career, but I wanted to have a child. And I thought it was gonna have to be a one or the other decision, and at that moment, I was so thankful to him, you know, and then we worked together for the rest of the time. He was my city manager.
That's
But,
wonderful. I think,
Yeah,
I
those,
think that is a wonderful place actually to
end.
end. That's a wonderful.
That even the hard-nosed managers who have to be
Yeah.
hard-nosed because they have to produce,
Yeah.
there's a human being inside there
Yes.
too. There is a
That's-
human being there somewhere,
That's
if you could
wonderful.
just find it. And but I knew I couldn't do it face to face. I debated about that for a while, and I knew I cannot walk into his office and tell him that I'm expecting a baby. I mean, I was legally married. I legally held a master's degree, and I was fairly competent in what I was doing, but I thought, this is just gonna be the end of everything, you know. And then gradually, you know, there were more women in the building and in all the buildings of the city, and they even finally at one point, they designated a place in most buildings where there was any space available where they could nurse or, you know, or pump milk during the daytime if they needed to. And I thought, gee, the world has grown up.
And when do you think that was, that happened? Long after your daughter was born?
It was a good many years afterwards, but not really that long. It started changing. She was born in 81. I'd say probably in the early 90s.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, it started changing.
okay.
And, you know, that was a good thing to see, because we hired, you know, we couldn't pay the top of the salary scale to attract really good talent on the national scene, but we attracted fairly good talent, but a lot of them were coming right out of the graduate school, or maybe only 1 or 2 years of work, and so they hadn't started their families either, and they were getting ready to, you know, to have to do that if they were going to. You know, you can't wait forever. And so I was really proud of the city when they did that too. I thought, okay, we're not so afraid of this that we, you know, all of a sudden say a female professional becomes totally incompetent once she has a child, you know, and can't be trusted to show up when it's hard for her to show up, you know. But we did.
So let's end there.
Okay.
And Glenda, I cannot thank you enough
Okay.
for taking this time with me. This has been wonderful.